Everyone knows Stonehenge, the massive stones standing in a circle on Salisbury Plain, arranged with such precision that people still travel from around the world to watch the sun rise perfectly between them on the solstice. It's one of the most photographed, most studied, most argued about structures on the entire planet. But here's something most visitors never learn when they stand there taking pictures. Stonehenge wasn't the first monument built on that land, not even close. Nearly 1,000 years before anyone dragged the first sarsen stone into position, there was already something ancient lying across that landscape, something so large you could walk for an entire hour and still not reach the end of it. It didn't rise up dramatically like the stones would later. It didn't announce itself. It was two parallel ditches and banks running almost 2 miles across the plain, wide enough in places to fit several football fields side by side. Today, archaeologists call it the Stonehenge Cursus, and honestly, we still don't fully understand why it was built. Think about that for a second. We know more about why the pyramids of Egypt were constructed than we know about this earthwork sitting practically in Stonehenge's backyard. We can tell you roughly when it was dug. We can tell you who probably wasn't involved. We can tell you what tools were likely used, but if you ask the simple question, what was it for, the honest answer from most archaeologists is, we're still figuring that out. That's the strange part about the Cursus. It's not hidden underground in some remote location waiting to be discovered like a lost tomb. It's right there, plainly visible from the air, a massive scar across the earth that farmers have ploughed around for centuries without fully realizing what they were looking at. And yet, despite sitting in one of the most heavily studied archaeological landscapes on Earth, it remains one of the biggest mysteries in British prehistory. So today, we're going to dig into that mystery properly. We're going to trace who these builders actually were, the people who came before the more famous Stonehenge crowd, the ones who moved earth by hand across nearly 2 miles of chalky ground, using nothing but antler picks and sheer determination. We're going to look at how modern archaeology finally found this monument buried beneath centuries of soil and crops. We're going to explore the landscape around it, the burial mounds, the pits, the possible pathways, all pointing toward a sacred geography that existed long before the stones arrived. And then we're going to ask the hardest question of all. What happened to these people? Because here's the unsettling truth that recent archaeology and ancient DNA research have started to reveal. The population that built the Cursus doesn't appear to be the same population that later built Stonehenge. Somewhere between one monument and the next, an entire culture seems to have been replaced, erased almost, leaving behind earthworks but very few clear answers about who they were or where they went. Before we get into all of that, if you're listening to this while trying to fall asleep, that's exactly what I make these for. So go ahead and hit follow on Spotify if you're listening there. And if you've got a moment, leaving a 5-star review genuinely helps this channel more than you'd think. It's the best way to support what we're doing here. And while you're at it, drop a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is right there. I check these constantly, and it's wild seeing London at midnight, Sydney at sunrise, Toronto right before bed, all stacking up in the same thread. Now, let's go back before the stones, back before anyone carved a single sarsen, back to a flat stretch of chalk plain, where a forgotten people decided to dig 2 ditches nearly 2 miles long, for reasons that, even today, we can only guess at. To really understand what the Cursus means, you have to stop thinking about Stonehenge as one isolated structure sitting alone on an empty plain. That's the image most of us grew up with. A single ring of stones in the middle of nowhere, mysterious and solitary, like it fell out of the sky and landed on Salisbury Plain by accident. But that image is wrong. Stonehenge was never alone. It sat and still sits, inside an enormous ceremonial landscape packed with dozens of monuments, mounds, ditches and features spread across several square miles. Long barrows, henges, processional avenues, clusters of burial mounds numbering in the hundreds. Stonehenge is really just the most famous piece of a much larger puzzle, and the Cursus is one of the oldest pieces of that puzzle we've found. That timing matters more than it might seem at first. When people picture Stonehenge being built, they usually picture one continuous project, a single burst of construction where ancient Britons showed up, planned it out, and built the whole thing in one go. That's not remotely what happened. Stonehenge itself was built and rebuilt in phases over roughly 1,500 years, with the iconic stone circle we recognise today not taking its current form until somewhere around 2500 BCE. The Cursus, on the other hand, has been dated to somewhere around 3500 BCE, possibly earlier. That's not a small gap. That's close to 1,000 years standing between the digging of those two ditches and the raising of the first sarsen stones. To put that into perspective, 1,000 years before the Magna Carta was signed, most of Europe hadn't even developed anything resembling the political systems we'd recognise as medieval states yet. 1,000 years is enough time for entire civilizations to rise, transform, and vanish. And somewhere within that 1,000 years, whoever built the Cursus completed their monument. And then, as far as we can tell, an entirely different set of hands eventually raised the stones that made the site famous. So why don't more people know about this? Why does the Cursus barely register compared to Stonehenge in the popular imagination? Part of the answer is embarrassingly simple. Standing stones are dramatic. They're vertical, they're massive, they catch the light, they throw shadows, they photograph beautifully at sunrise. A bank and ditch monument does none of that. It doesn't rise up to meet you. It doesn't demand your attention. If you walked across the Cursus today without knowing it was there, you'd probably notice nothing more than a gentle swell and dip in the grass, barely more dramatic than a shallow drainage channel. Over 5,500 years, wind, rain, farming and grazing have worn the earthworks down until what was once a significant excavation, ditches that may have been over 1.5 meters deep with banks piled up beside them, has been reduced to little more than a soft undulation in the turf. Nature is patient, and it erases things slowly, but it erases them completely. This is actually one of the strange ironies of studying ancient earthworks compared to stone monuments. Stone survives obstinately. It sits there for thousands of years, basically daring you to ignore it. Earth doesn't do that. Earth returns to itself. It gets rained on, it gets grown over, it gets ploughed by farmers who have no idea they're driving equipment across a 5,000-year-old sacred boundary, which is more or less exactly what happened to the Cursus for centuries. Local farmers ploughed straight through parts of it without a second thought, because from ground level there was nothing obviously there to protect. No fallen stones, no rubble, no telltale ruins. Just slightly different soil compaction and drainage patterns hidden beneath the crops. Now let's talk about what we're actually dealing with here in terms of size, because the scale of this thing is genuinely hard to picture until you compare it to something familiar. The Stonehenge Cursus stretches roughly 2 miles from end to end, running across the landscape just north of where Stonehenge itself would eventually be built. 2 parallel ditches run along its length, spaced somewhere around 100 to 150 meters apart, which means the enclosed strip of land between them is wide enough that you could comfortably fit several football pitches side by side across its width. It runs, generally speaking, along a rough east-to-west orientation, though the alignment isn't perfectly straight. It curves slightly, bends here and there, following the natural contours of the chalk landscape, rather than cutting through it with rigid geometric precision. That detail alone tells us something. Whoever built it wasn't purely obsessed with mathematical perfection. They were working with the land, not against it. If you tried to walk the entire length of the Cursus at a normal pace, it would take you close to an hour, maybe longer depending on the terrain. An hour of walking simply to go from one end of a single monument to the other. Try imagining that as the finished product of a construction project using nothing but antler picks, wooden shovels and raw physical labour. We'll get into exactly how brutal that process likely was a little later, but for now, just sit with the scale of it. 2 ditches, each roughly 2 miles long, dug largely by hand into solid chalk bedrock, by a population that almost certainly numbered in the low thousands at most across the entire region. And here's where the story really starts to shift the ground beneath what most people think they know about Stonehenge. If the Cursus came first, built by a population working nearly 1,000 years before the first standing stones went up, then the entire narrative changes. Stonehenge wasn't the beginning of something, it was closer to the middle, or maybe even a later chapter in a much longer story of ritual construction happening on that plain. The people who eventually built the stone circle weren't inventing sacred geography from scratch. They were arriving into a landscape that had already been shaped, marked, and used for ceremonial purposes for centuries before they showed up. In a sense, they inherited a stage that had already been set. This also raises a question that archaeologists have been wrestling with for decades now. If the Cursus predates Stonehenge by that much time, was it built by ancestors of the same people who eventually raised the stones? Or were they a completely separate group, with the site itself passing between different communities over the centuries, each one adding their own layer of meaning to ground that was already considered significant? We're going to dig much deeper into that question later, because the genetic evidence complicates things in ways that most people don't expect. But for now, it's enough to sit with this simple, almost uncomfortable fact. Nearly 1,000 years before anyone thought to move a single sarsen stone, someone else had already decided that this particular stretch of chalky plain deserved a monument. And that monument, unlike the one that made the site famous, was built not to rise up toward the sky, but to stretch flat and enormous across the earth, quietly waiting nearly 5,500 years to be properly understood. So what exactly is a cursus? The word sounds ancient Roman, maybe even Celtic. It sounds like the name of something whose purpose should be obvious. But it isn't. In fact, the name itself is one of the reasons people have been confused about these monuments for nearly 300 years. A cursus is a long Neolithic earthwork, usually made from 2 parallel ditches with banks built alongside them. Together, those lines create a vast enclosed strip of land. Sometimes the strip is narrow, sometimes it is wide enough to contain an entire village. Sometimes the monument runs for a few hundred meters. Others stretch for miles over hills, across valleys, and through landscapes that must have looked very different when they were first built. The basic layout is recognizable. 2 long boundaries, usually roughly parallel, though not always perfectly straight. Often there are terminals at one or both ends, where the ditches curve inward, close off, or simply stop. From above, the shape can look almost like a giant runway carved into the earth, or a corridor, or an avenue without walls. And that apparent simplicity is deceptive. Because once you ask what the people who built these things actually intended them to be, the answers start slipping away. The name Cursus was given by an 18th century antiquarian named William Stukely. Stukely was one of the first people to study the monuments around Stonehenge in a serious, detailed way. He walked the landscape, mapped features, measured ditches, and tried to make sense of structures that had already become ancient long before Roman Britain, before written history, before almost everything we think of as the past. When he saw the long parallel earthworks north of Stonehenge, Stukely thought they resembled a Roman racecourse. In Latin, cursus means a course, a running track or a route. And once that label was attached, it stuck. But there is a problem. Nothing about the evidence proves these monuments were racecourses. There are no grandstands, no signs of organised athletic events. No starting gates, no finish lines, no obvious features suggesting competition or spectators. More importantly, many cursuses would have made terrible tracks. Their ground was uneven, their routes climbed slopes, crossed rough terrain, and sometimes changed direction in ways that make no sense if speed was the goal. The Stonehenge Cursus itself is broad, irregular, and shaped by the land beneath it. You could walk through it, you could process through it, but racing across it? That is an idea imposed by a later observer who was trying to compare something deeply unfamiliar with something he already understood. This happens constantly in archaeology. We find an ancient object or structure, and our brains immediately search for a modern equivalent. Is it a road? A house? A fort? A temple? A track? But Neolithic people did not organise their world around our categories. Something can be a boundary, a ritual space, a route, a gathering place, and a statement of power all at once. The fact that a cursus looks like a corridor does not mean it was built for one simple purpose. And there is another strange detail. The banks created from the dug-up earth often appear to have been placed on the outside of the ditches, not the inside. That matters. If these were enclosures designed to keep people, animals, or enemies contained, you might expect the banks to reinforce the interior edge. Instead, in many examples, the layout seems less defensive than symbolic, less like a wall, and more like a line drawn across the land. Think about what that means. Someone did not just dig a ditch. They created two immense visible boundaries, defining a zone that may have been different from the world outside it. A place you entered deliberately, a place you crossed with intention, a place where ordinary movement may have become ritual movement. Across Britain and Ireland, archaeologists have identified dozens of Cursus monuments. And they are not all alike. That is one reason their function remains so difficult to pin down. Some are short and compact, only a few hundred metres long. Others are enormous. The Dorset Cursus, for example, runs for roughly 6 miles across the chalk-down land of southern England. 6 miles? That is not a single building, it is an entire piece of landscape reorganised by human hands. Some cursuses are nearly straight, others bend and shift with the contours of hills and valleys. Some are narrow, creating something that really does resemble a long passage. Others are so broad that a person standing at one ditch might barely make out the bank on the other side. Some have clear terminals, others seem open-ended, fading into damaged ground, later farming, or uncertainty in the archaeological record. A few may have been constructed in stages extended, altered, or used over generations. So cursus is not really the name of one standardized thing. It is a modern archaeological category, a label we use for monuments that share a family resemblance. Long parallel boundaries, Neolithic date, a sense of enclosure or direction. Beyond that, the differences are almost as important as the similarities. And the fact that communities across Britain and Ireland kept building these huge linear monuments suggests the idea behind them mattered. This was not an accidental byproduct of farming. It was not just a field boundary. People were making choices. They were choosing particular routes, particular ridges, particular views, particular relationships with rivers, hills, burial sites and horizons. They were investing enormous labour in monuments that may not have produced food, shelter, or military protection. That means whatever a cursus did, it probably operated in the realm of belief, identity, ceremony, and social organisation. One theory is that they were processional routes, spaces where people moved in groups during seasonal rituals, funerals, initiations, or gatherings between scattered communities. Another is that they marked sacred boundaries, separating ordinary territory from ground associated with ancestors, spirits, or important ceremonies. Some researchers have suggested they were used for exchange and assembly, places where different groups met and negotiated relationships. Others see astronomical significance in certain alignments, especially where the cursus points toward a notable horizon, a rising sun, or a distant landmark. And maybe the frustrating answer is that different cursuses serve different purposes. A monument stretching for 6 miles across Dorset may not have meant exactly the same thing as one built on Salisbury Plain. Even the same cursus could have changed meaning over centuries. The people who first cut its ditches might have had one purpose. Their descendants might have reused it for another. Later communities might have treated it as an ancestral place, already ancient and powerful precisely because nobody remembered why it had first been built. That possibility is crucial at Stonehenge. By the time the first major phases of Stonehenge began, the cursus was already old. Not just old in the casual sense. Old enough that several generations had been born, lived and died since its ditches were first cut. It may already have carried the weight that ancient monuments always carry. The feeling that this ground had been chosen before you arrived, that people long gone had marked it for reasons you could sense, but could no longer fully explain. The Stonehenge Cursus is one of the most important examples because of where it sits. It lies just north of Stonehenge, crossing a landscape that would become one of prehistoric Britain's densest and most elaborate ceremonial complexes. It is not a side note. It is not an accidental ditch beside the main attraction. It is evidence that the plain had been transformed into meaningful space long before the stones appeared, and its layout gives us the first real glimpse of a pattern that will keep appearing throughout this story. The builders were not simply constructing objects. They were organising movement, directing attention, connecting one part of the landscape to another. A cursus is a monument you experience over time, not all at once. You enter it, you move beside it, you follow it towards something beyond the next rise. Which raises the question that has haunted archaeologists ever since Stukely first gave it its misleading name. If the Stonehenge Cursus was not a racecourse, then what were people doing inside this enormous strip of sacred ground? And why did they choose this exact line across Salisbury Plain? Stand on Salisbury Plain today, and the Greater Cursus can be difficult to see at all. There is no towering wall, no row of stones pointing the way, no grand entrance that announces itself from a distance. The monument survives mostly as a subtle disturbance in the rolling chalk landscape north of Stonehenge. A slight change in the ground, a shallow dip where a ditch once ran, a crop growing a little greener because ancient soil beneath it holds more moisture. But 5,000 years ago this would have been impossible to ignore. The Greater Cursus ran broadly from east to west for almost 3 kilometres, just under 2 miles, across the high ground of Salisbury Plain. It was not perfectly straight in the way a modern road is straight. Its course adjusted slightly to the contours beneath it. But the overall intention was unmistakable. 2 immense lines held at a roughly consistent distance apart, cut across the open chalkland and created a corridor on a scale far beyond any ordinary settlement boundary. At its widest, the space between those boundaries was around 100 metres. That is roughly the length of a football field. Imagine standing in the middle of it when the banks were fresh, the chalk bright where it had been dug and piled, the earth newly exposed, the edges sharp. You would be inside a deliberately created strip of landscape, with one boundary to the north and another to the south, extending away toward opposite horizons. And Stonehenge, still centuries in the future, lay to the south. That relationship matters. The cursus does not point directly at the stone circle because the stone circle did not yet exist. But it occupies the same extraordinary landscape. Its eastern end lies on higher ground, while its route continues westward across subtle ridges and shallow valleys. It passes through terrain that later generations would fill with barrows, pits, avenues, timber circles, and eventually the stones themselves. This was not empty countryside. It was becoming a designed landscape. The structure of the cursus was simple in principle, but enormous in execution. On each side, workers dug a long ditch. The chalk and soil taken from those ditches were then heaped into banks. Crucially, the banks appear to have stood on the outer sides of the ditches. If you were inside the cursus, you did not encounter a bank first and then a ditch. You encountered the ditch with the raised earth beyond it. That is a strange arrangement if the goal was defence. A defensive enclosure normally puts the bank where it offers the greatest advantage to the people inside. A farmer trying to pen animals would also want a practical barrier. But the greater cursus does not behave like a fort, a livestock corral, or a convenient field boundary. The outward-facing banks made the whole structure read differently. The interior was defined, but not necessarily protected. The ditches marked a threshold. The banks made that threshold visible from outside. It was as if the builders had taken a vast area of open ground and declared, "This space is set apart." The two long sides did not continue forever. At the east and west ends, the monument terminated. The ditches curved, narrowed, or stopped, forming what archaeologists call terminals. These terminals are important because they suggest the cursus was not just two unrelated lines. It was a single planned construction with limits, direction, and perhaps designated ways of entering or leaving. Exactly how people moved through it remains uncertain. There may have been gaps or causeways where the ditches could be crossed more easily. Some entrances may have been original, others could reflect later disturbance, erosion, or centuries of people and animals choosing the easiest route across. Archaeology can reveal a break in a ditch. It cannot always tell us whether that break was a formal gateway, a later crossing, or a place where the original earthwork has simply vanished. But the terminals themselves make one thing clear. This was a route with beginnings and endings, or at least it was a place where movement could be controlled. Think about the experience. A group approaches from the eastern end. Ahead lies an enormous open corridor framed by banks and ditches. Behind them is the ordinary landscape, grazing ground, tracks, scattered homes, places where daily work happens. Then they cross into the cursus. Perhaps they walk westward in procession. Perhaps they gather at a terminal. Perhaps the wide interior is used for ceremonies that require hundreds of people, with the boundaries creating a stage on a scale no timber hall could contain. We do not know, but the sheer physical form of the monument tells us that movement mattered. Direction mattered. Crossing from outside to inside mattered. The difficulty is that the monument we see now is not the monument they built. 5 millennia of weather have softened it. Rain washed soil down the slopes. Frost cracked and shifted the exposed chalk. Grass rooted into the banks. Burrowing animals churned the ground, and then came agriculture. Generations of ploughing gradually shaved down the raised banks, spreading their material across the surface, until features that once stood clearly above the plain became almost invisible. Modern land use has added another layer of damage and confusion. Tracks, fences, roads, military activity and cultivation have cut across parts of the ancient route. Some sections survive as earthworks only where the ground escaped intensive ploughing. Elsewhere, the cursus survives mainly below the surface, preserved as darker fills in the old ditches. In a way, the monument has been erased twice. First, naturally, by time and weather, then deliberately but unintentionally by people remaking the land for fields, roads and modern life. And yet it has never disappeared completely. From the air, especially under the right conditions, the lost lines begin to return. In dry weather, crops growing above buried ditches can stay greener for longer, because the ditch fills retain moisture. In other seasons, the same buried features may show as pale lines, where shallow soil dries quickly over the remains of old banks. These are crop marks and soil marks, faint signals from structures no longer visible at ground level. Aerial photography turned the archaeology of Salisbury Plain inside out. What looked like ordinary fields became maps of buried monuments. Long ditches, circular barrows, enclosures, pits, tracks. Entire arrangements of ancient activity appearing not as ruins above the ground, but as patterns written into living crops. Then geophysical survey made the picture sharper. Techniques such as magnetometry can detect changes in the soil caused by filled ditches, burning, pits and disturbed chalk. Ground-penetrating radar and other methods can add further detail without digging vast trenches. Archaeologists can walk across a field with instruments, collect thousands of measurements, and build an image of what lies beneath the grass. Not a perfect image, not a photograph of the past, but enough to trace the ghost of the Cursus across land where its banks have been flattened for centuries. That is how an invisible monument becomes visible again. And when its full line is reconstructed, the scale becomes almost unsettling. This was not a few households marking the edge of a garden. This was a project requiring planning, coordination and labour on a level that early farming communities are often denied in popular imagination. There were no metal spades, no engines, no survey equipment, no written plans. Workers likely used antler picks to break the chalk, stone tools to cut and scrape, and wooden shovels or baskets to move the spoil. Every metre of ditch meant hours of digging. Every basket of chalk had to be lifted, carried and piled into a bank. And this happened not once, but along both sides of a monument nearly 3 kilometres long. The builders had to agree on a line before they ever began cutting it. They had to organise people, feed them, decide where work started and where it ended, maintain a shared idea of what this immense earthwork was supposed to become. Maybe it was built quickly during a great gathering. Maybe it took seasons, even years, with different communities contributing labour. The evidence cannot yet give us a construction diary. But it can give us the result, a colossal statement made in earth, a statement that said this place mattered enough to reshape. And once that line existed, nobody crossing Salisbury Plain could treat the landscape as ordinary again. That is the strange thing about the Greater Cursus. For thousands of years it remained present without being fully seen. People never abandoned Salisbury Plain. Farmers crossed it. Shepherds grazed animals over it. Travellers passed through it. Later communities raised burial mounds nearby. Roman roads cut across the wider region. Medieval fields reshaped the soil, modern armies trained on the plain. Stonehenge drew visitors, antiquarians, surveyors, tourists and archaeologists by the thousands. And yet this enormous monument, almost 2 miles long, could fade into the background. The first people who tried to make sense of the Stonehenge landscape were not archaeologists in the modern sense. They were antiquarians, curious scholars, clergymen, landowners and collectors who wandered the chalk downs in the 17th and 18th centuries, measuring barrows, sketching stones and trying to connect the ruins they could see. Stonehenge was impossible to ignore. So were the great burial mounds scattered around it. Those monuments rose above the ground. They announced themselves. A barrow says, someone put something here. Something happened here. Somebody wanted this place remembered. The Cursus was different, By the time early surveyors began recording the landscape, its banks had already been worn down and ploughed over in places. The ditches had filled. The original sharp edges had softened into long, almost natural-looking undulations. Someone standing on the ground could walk across part of it and never realize they had crossed one side of a Neolithic monument. But some early observers noticed that the land was behaving oddly. They saw long, linear ridges, shallow trenches, earthworks that did not fit the normal patterns of fields or roads. William Stukely, the famous 18th century antiquarian who spent years studying Stonehenge and Avebury, recorded a long enclosure north of Stonehenge in the 1720s. He called it a cursus, borrowing the Latin word for a racecourse. That name stuck. The name was almost certainly wrong about the function. There is no good evidence that Neolithic people used these monuments for races. But Stukely had recognised something important. This was not random terrain. It was an enormous deliberate work, a long bounded space extending across the plain. He was seeing the earthwork at a moment when more of it still survived above ground. That matters because archaeology is not just about discovering the past. It is also about racing against its disappearance. A feature recorded on an 18th century plan may be almost gone today. A bank that looked clear to Stukely may have been reduced by another 300 years of cultivation. A ditch that could once be traced as a shallow depression may now survive only as a stain beneath a modern field. Sometimes the oldest maps and sketches are not quaint historical curiosities. They are evidence. They preserve details of monuments before industrial farming, development and erosion took another bite out of them. But early surveys had limits. Antiquarians could measure what they saw, and they often saw a great deal. Yet they did not have the tools to look beneath the grass. They could not easily tell whether a faint rise was natural geology or an ancient bank. They could not follow a buried ditch once it vanished beneath a ploughed field, and they could not see how one monument connected with dozens of others across miles of landscape. Then archaeology learned to fly. In the early 20th century, aerial photography transformed the study of prehistoric Britain. Suddenly, investigators were no longer trapped at ground level, staring across fields and trying to make sense of subtle bumps in the land. From above, patterns emerged. A ditch filled with darker, richer soil can change the crops growing over it. In dry weather, plants above that buried ditch may have access to more moisture. They grow taller, greener, or ripen later than the crops around them. A former bank can produce the opposite effect. Its buried remains may lie closer to the surface, where the soil is thinner and dries faster. Crops above it may grow poorly. The landscape begins to reveal itself in stripes, circles, shadows, and changes of colour. To a farmer, it may look like uneven growth. To an aerial archaeologist, it can look like a lost monument returning from the dead. This was especially powerful on chalkland like Salisbury Plain. Chalk preserves ditches well. When prehistoric people cut through the white bedrock, they created deep scars in the ground. Over centuries, those scars filled with soil, stones, rubbish, pollen, charcoal, and material washed in from the surrounding banks. Even after the surface earthwork disappears, the filled ditch can remain underground as a long archive of the original construction. Aerial photographs helped archaeologists trace Cursus monuments across landscapes where they had seemed broken, incomplete, or invisible. They revealed barrows flattened by ploughing, old field systems, enclosures, pits, tracks, monuments that had not vanished at all but had simply changed form. The ground had become a document. You just needed to know how to read it. But aerial photography has its own weaknesses. Crop marks only appear under the right conditions. A wet summer may hide features that a drought would expose. Different crops reveal different traces. A buried ditch can be obvious in wheat and nearly invisible in grass. Shadows can make an earthwork dramatic in low winter sunlight, then erase it completely at noon. And some parts of the landscape are simply obscured by roads, buildings, woodland, or later disturbance. So archaeologists added more tools. LIDAR, which uses laser pulses from aircraft to measure tiny variations in the ground surface, can strip away vegetation digitally and reveal earthworks hidden beneath trees or scrub. It is extraordinarily useful for detecting subtle ridges, hollow ways, banks, and old boundaries. A landscape that appears featureless to the eye can become textured with prehistoric lines. But LIDAR cannot see through the ground. It can show the surviving shape of a bank. It cannot tell you when that bank was built, who built it, or what ceremonies may have happened beside it. Magnetometry goes underground in a different way. Soil has magnetic properties, and human activity changes them. A ditch filled with darker organic soil may produce a different magnetic signal from the undisturbed chalk around it. Burning can leave particularly strong traces. Pits, hearths, post holes, and later disturbances can all appear as anomalies on a geophysical survey. Again, that word matters: anomalies. A magnetometry plot is not a picture of the past. It is a map of differences. A dark line might be a Neolithic ditch, or it might be a modern drain, an old fence line, a military trench, or a buried service pipe. Interpretation is the hard part. Archaeologists have to compare the signals with aerial images, maps, geology, excavation results, and everything else known about the site. Then comes excavation. Excavation is the most direct method archaeology has because it allows researchers to cut through a ditch and read its layers. They can see where the original chalk was cut. They can measure its depth and profile. They can identify later silts and fills. They can recover antler picks, animal bone, charcoal, pottery, pollen, or tiny fragments of worked flint. Those remains can sometimes provide dates. They can reveal what the local environment was like. Pollen trapped in ditch sediments may suggest whether the surrounding land was wooded, open, cultivated, or grazed. Snails preserved in chalk soils can indicate changing conditions over time. Chemical traces can hint at burning, animal activity, or the movement of material through the landscape. But excavation destroys what it investigates. Once a trench is dug, that precise section of the monument has been removed forever. Everything depends on recording it properly, every layer photographed, every soil sample labelled, every find located. Archaeologists do not excavate a site because digging is exciting. They excavate because a specific question cannot be answered any other way. And even then, the answers are incomplete. A ditch can tell us it was dug. It can tell us how deep it was. It can sometimes tell us roughly when construction happened. It may even preserve evidence that people placed objects in it deliberately. But it cannot replay the gathering. It cannot give us the words spoken there. It cannot tell us whether the people who crossed into the cursus felt fear, pride, grief, celebration, or awe. Archaeology is powerful precisely because it works with fragments. A line in a crop field, a magnetic shadow, a change in soil, a piece of antler at the bottom of a ditch. None of these is the whole story. But put them together, and the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. The greater cursus was real. It was planned. It was immense. And beneath the grass, beneath the plough soil, beneath all the later monuments that crowded into this sacred plain, its original cut still survives. The next question is the one that changes everything. When exactly did people first decide to dig it? The answer lies at the bottom of the ditches. Not in the grass, not in the faint banks, not in the enormous shape visible from the air. The date of the greater cursus is buried in the material that fell, washed, or was placed into those freshly cut chalk trenches thousands of years ago. This is where radiocarbon dating becomes crucial. Living things absorb carbon while they are alive. Plants take it from the atmosphere. Animals take it in by eating plants or eating animals that ate plants. But when an organism dies, that exchange stops. One form of carbon, carbon-14, begins to decay at a measurable rate. Measure how much remains in a piece of charcoal, bone, antler, seed, or wood, and scientists can estimate how long ago that organism died. Find the right material in the right layer of a Cursus ditch, and suddenly the monument begins to enter historical time. Not history with names and written records, nothing like that. But time measured in generations, time measured in living people. Archaeologists excavating the Greater Cursus do not simply pull one object from the soil, send it to a laboratory, and announce the exact year construction began. It is much more complicated than that. A ditch is not a sealed time capsule. The moment it was dug, wind began blowing dust into it. Rain washed loose chalk and soil down its sides. Plants grew along the edges. Animals burrowed into the fills. People may have dropped, thrown, or deliberately deposited objects there years, decades, even centuries later. A bone found near the top of a ditch could be much younger than the monument itself. It might date a later visit, not the first great construction. So the most valuable samples usually come from the lowest deposits, close to the original cut into the chalk. Imagine the builders have just completed one section of ditch. The sides are sharp. The floor is clean white chalk. Then a storm comes. Small fragments collapse from the edge. Sediment begins collecting at the bottom. Perhaps an antler pick breaks during the work and is left behind. Perhaps charcoal from a nearby fire is swept into the trench. Those earliest layers can provide a minimum age for the digging, or at least bring us very close to it. And when multiple samples from carefully recorded layers begin pointing toward the same period, the picture strengthens. For the Greater Cursus, that picture places its likely construction in the early Neolithic, during the 4th millennium BCE. In broad terms, this immense earthwork was probably created around 3600 to 3400 BCE, long before Stonehenge became the stone monument people imagine today. Stop and think about what that means. The Greater Cursus was already ancient when the first ditch and bank of Stonehenge were laid out. Stonehenge did not appear in an empty landscape. It was not the first bold idea anyone had ever had on Salisbury Plain. By the time people began creating the earliest formal Stonehenge earthwork, around 3000 BCE, this long enclosure to the north had likely been standing, or at least remaining visible in the land, for centuries. Maybe 300 years old, maybe 500. Potentially more, depending on exactly when different parts were built, and how the dates are interpreted. That is the scale we are dealing with. For us, 300 years is the distance between the present day and the age of sailing ships, muskets, and early modern kingdoms. It is a span long enough for languages to change, political systems to rise and vanish, whole landscapes to be remade. To the people building Stonehenge, the Cursus may have belonged to the deep past. Not a forgotten past, necessarily, but an inherited one. A monument made by ancestors they could not possibly have known. Radiocarbon dating cannot usually reduce that story to one dramatic number. It does not tell us the first basket of chalk was lifted on this exact morning in 3527 BCE. The dates come as ranges because the science itself has limits, and because the past does not cooperate with our desire for precision. First, every radiocarbon measurement has a margin of uncertainty. A sample can be contaminated. Its context can be disturbed. The object itself may have been old before it entered the ditch. A piece of oak charcoal, for example, might come from the heartwood of a tree that had lived for centuries. Date that charcoal, and you may be dating the tree's early growth rather than the moment people burned it. Then there is the atmosphere. The amount of carbon-14 in the atmosphere has not remained perfectly constant through time. It changes because of solar activity, Earth's magnetic field, ocean circulation, and other natural processes. So radiocarbon years must be calibrated against independent records, especially tree rings. That calibration can turn one laboratory result into a range of possible calendar dates. Sometimes the curve is smooth, sometimes it has plateaus and wiggles that widen the uncertainty. That is why archaeologists speak carefully around 3600 BCE, in the middle of the 4th millennium BCE, earlier than Stonehenge's main construction. Contemporary with the first farming communities spreading and transforming much of southern Britain. Those phrases are not evasions, they are honesty, and even with uncertainty, the chronology is powerful. The Greater Cursus belongs to a world before Stonehenge's Great Sarsen Circle, before the famous uprights and lintels were raised around 2500 BCE. It predates the bluestone arrangements that were added and rearranged over later phases. It almost certainly predates Stonehenge's earliest monumental ditch and bank enclosure by several centuries. But there is one complication. The Stonehenge landscape had human stories even older than the Cursus. Near Stonehenge, archaeologists have found traces of Mesolithic activity, including ancient post holes dating back to around 8000 BCE. That does not mean Stonehenge existed then. It did not. But it means people had noticed, used, and perhaps marked this part of the landscape thousands of years before the Neolithic monuments appeared. So this was not a place that suddenly became important one day. It was a place whose importance kept changing. First, perhaps, it was a hunting landscape. A place of woodland clearings, wild animals, seasonal movement, and small groups returning to familiar ground. Then farming arrived, forests were cleared, herds and crops altered the land. Long barrows appeared, linking communities with their dead. Then the Greater Cursus cut its immense line across the plain. Later still came Stonehenge, burial mounds, avenues, circles, pits, and countless traces of people returning to the same broad horizon. No single generation owned this landscape. That may be the real significance of the dates. The Cursus was not merely older than Stonehenge, it was part of the reason Stonehenge was built where it was. Not necessarily because later builders understood exactly what the earlier monument meant. Meanings can shift, rituals can disappear, old places can become mysterious even to the descendants of those who made them. But ancient monuments have a way of holding their ground. A bank slowly erodes. A ditch fills with soil. The original purpose becomes harder to recover. Yet the line remains. People see it, cross it, avoid it. Build beside it, bury their dead near it, tell stories about it. Or perhaps say nothing at all, because everyone already knows it is there. And that raises an even more difficult question. Who were the people capable of organising this colossal first construction? They were not the Stonehenge people. Stonehenge did not exist yet. They were not a single tribe with one leader, one village, one flag, or one grand plan written down somewhere on animal skin. Nothing in the archaeology allows us to imagine that kind of unified nation behind the Greater Cursus. They were early Neolithic farming communities living in Britain during the 4th millennium BCE, people whose parents, grandparents, or more distant ancestors had brought new ways of life across the Channel from continental Europe. They arrived in a land still dominated by woodland, rivers, chalk downs, and open clearings, and over generations they began changing it. Not all at once. Not everywhere. Britain had been occupied by hunter-gatherers for thousands of years before farming appeared. Those earlier communities knew the coasts, forests, wetlands, and seasonal routes of the island intimately. But around 4000 BCE, a different economic system began taking hold. People started keeping cattle, sheep, goats, and pigs. They cultivated crops, especially cereals such as wheat and barley. They made pottery, they built timber structures, they buried some of their dead in collective tombs. The shift was enormous. A hunter-gatherer group can move with the changing availability of wild food. A farming community has to think further ahead. You need seed saved from the previous year. You need animals protected through winter. You need places where crops can grow. You need to know when to clear, when to sow, when to harvest, when to move livestock, and how much food must be stored before the cold returns. That does not mean these people settle down in permanent villages like modern farmers. This is one of the strangest things about the early Neolithic in Britain. They had domesticated animals, they grew crops, but many may still have moved frequently through familiar territories. Archaeologists find relatively few obvious, long-lived village sites from this period. Instead, the evidence often suggests a more flexible way of life. Small communities shifting between seasonal places, tending herds, visiting fields, gathering wild resources, and returning to important sites at particular times of year. They were farmers, but they were not farmers in the later medieval sense, living generation after generation in one fixed hamlet, surrounded by permanent fields. Cattle may have been especially important, not merely as meat. Cattle were mobile wealth. They provided milk, hides, bone, horn manure, and prestige. A herd could be moved across the landscape. It could be exchanged, given in marriage alliances, sacrificed at gatherings, or used to mark the status of a family. Sheep and pigs mattered too, and cultivated grains were becoming part of the diet. But early Neolithic life was probably still a mixed economy, built from farming, herding, hunting, fishing, and gathering. The old woodland world did not simply vanish when farming arrived. People opened clearings. They cut trees for houses, fires, fences, tools, and monuments. They grazed animals in woodland edges. They may have encouraged certain useful plants and used the forest in carefully managed ways. But southern Britain was not instantly transformed into a bare agricultural plain. Much of it remained wooded. The open chalk landscapes we associate with Salisbury Plain today were created and maintained over long periods by grazing, clearance, and repeated human use. To the builders of the Cursus, this place may have looked very different. There were probably more trees in the valleys and lower ground. Patches of scrub and woodland may have broken up the view. Yet the high chalk ridges offered broad routes, dry ground, and distant horizons. They were places where people, animals, and ideas could move. And somehow, across this changing landscape, groups came together to create a monument nearly 3 kilometres long. That is the real mystery, because the Greater Cursus was not a project one household could complete after harvest. It required hundreds, perhaps thousands of people contributing labour at different moments. Someone had to decide where the line would run. Someone or many someones had to mark it out across uneven ground. People had to clear the route, organise work parties, provide food, care for children, tend animals, repair tools, and keep the whole operation moving. And then there was the digging. The ditches were cut through solid chalk. No iron picks, no steel shovels, no wheeled excavators. The builders worked with tools made from stone, wood, and antler. They broke apart the chalk, lifted it out in baskets or hides, and piled it into banks. Every metre demanded effort. Every load had to be carried by human hands. It is tempting to ask how many workers were needed, as if there must be a neat answer. There is not. The monument may have been built in one intense campaign with communities gathering from across the region for a season of work, or it may have grown section by section over years, perhaps even generations. Different groups could have taken responsibility for different stretches. The line may have been laid out first and then completed in stages. Archaeology cannot yet tell us exactly how the labour was organised. But the scale tells us something undeniable. These people could cooperate beyond the household. They could gather people who normally lived apart. They could feed them. They could direct effort toward a shared goal whose value was not simply practical. A ditch and bank almost 3 kilometres long, enclosing no obvious settlement and no ordinary field system, was an investment in meaning. Maybe it marked a route. Maybe it enclosed a ceremonial space. Maybe it divided one kind of landscape from another. Maybe people processed along it, met within it, or crossed it only at particular places and times. Whatever its purpose, building it required social coordination on a scale that made the community visible to itself. Think about that. A gathering begins. Families arrive with cattle, food, tools, and news from other valleys. People who know each other through marriage, exchange, or shared ancestors meet on the chalk. Some may be strangers, some may be rivals, but for a time they work beside one another. They dig, they haul, they shape the banks, they share meals, they settle disputes, they arrange marriages, they tell stories. Children watch adults transform the ground. By the time the work is finished, the monument has done more than mark the landscape. It has helped create the society capable of making it. That may be the key to monuments like the Greater Cursus. Collective construction does not only express unity that already exists, it can produce unity. It gives scattered communities a reason to gather, rules to follow, labour to share, and a memory that outlasts the people involved. Every time someone later walked beside those banks, they would have encountered the work of many hands. Perhaps the hands of grandparents, perhaps people from another valley, perhaps ancestors whose names were already becoming stories. But understanding how they organised themselves is only the beginning, because once people had gathered, planned, and committed to this immense line, they faced the most physical challenge of all. How do you dig a monument through chalk for miles without metal tools? The answer begins with a tool that looks almost absurdly simple. A red deer antler, not a metal pick, not even a stone axe. An antler cut from the skull, with the tines trimmed or broken away until the thick central beam could be gripped in both hands. Hard enough to strike and pry, tough enough to survive repeated blows. Replaceable when it splintered or wore down. Archaeologists have found antler tools in and around Neolithic earthworks across Britain. They are among the strongest clues we have for how people attacked the chalk. And when you picture the Greater Cursus being built, you should picture hundreds of these tools rising and falling, strike, break, pry, lift again. The chalk beneath Salisbury Plain is not granite. It is relatively soft bedrock, formed from the compressed remains of tiny marine organisms deposited in an ancient sea. But soft is a dangerous word here. Chalk can be cut. It can be fractured. In the right conditions, especially when damp, it can yield to repeated blows from antler, bone, and stone. But it does not simply fall away because someone wants a ditch. The builders first had to remove the turf and topsoil. Then came the harder work, breaking the pale bedrock beneath. Antler picks could loosen chunks of chalk. Stone tools could cut and scrape. Animal shoulder blades may have served as shovels or scoops. Wooden spades, digging sticks, baskets, hide slings, perhaps even woven containers would have carried the spoil up out of the cut. None of these tools sounds impressive beside an iron pickaxe. That is because we are used to measuring technology by its material. Bronze is better than stone. Iron is better than bronze. Steel is better than iron. But that is not the whole story. A tool becomes powerful when it is matched to a task, a landscape, and a workforce that knows how to use it. Antler was not a pathetic substitute for metal. For cutting chalk, it was useful. Wood was not primitive, because it was wood. A wooden shovel in strong hands can move an enormous amount of loose material. A flint blade may be small, but flint is sharper than steel at its edge. Bone tools could scrape, lever, and shape, and when one tool failed, the builders understood how to make another. Still, the physical scale is hard to escape. The Greater Cursus stretched for nearly 3 kilometres. Along much of its length ran 2 massive parallel ditches, separated by a broad central space. The ditches seen today are shallow traces, softened by nearly 6,000 years of erosion, ploughing, animal burrowing, and weather. When newly cut, they would have been deeper, sharper, brighter, and far more imposing. Imagine standing at the edge of one. The chalk face is raw and white. Freshly broken pieces lie underfoot. People are working below, swinging antler picks into the slope. Others crouch to fill baskets. A chain of hands passes spoil upward. At the top, workers tip load after load onto the bank. And that bank mattered just as much as the ditch. The material taken from the ground did not disappear. Most of it was probably piled beside the excavation, creating raised banks that ran parallel to the ditches. At the Greater Cursus, the banks appear to have been placed on the inside, facing the broad space between the ditches. That detail is strange if you expect a defensive boundary. A fort puts its bank where it helps defend against people outside. But the Cursus does not behave like a fort. Its arrangement seems to emphasize the interior. The ditches and banks may have made entering, crossing, or moving through this long enclosed corridor a deliberate act. They created edges. They turned open ground into a defined place. And in a newly built monument, those edges would have been impossible to miss. Fresh chalk banks may have gleamed across the landscape, almost white against darker turf, soil, scrub, and woodland. Even if the banks were not enormous by later prehistoric standards, their length gave them force. A low bank extending over the horizon is not a small thing. It tells you that someone has changed the land on purpose. How much labour did that take? This is where we have to be careful. Archaeologists can estimate ditch volumes. They can calculate how much chalk may have been removed. They can test replica antler picks and wooden shovels. They can ask how long it takes a person to cut a cubic metre of chalk, carry spoil, and build a bank. From there they can produce totals in person days, perhaps thousands, perhaps tens of thousands, depending on the assumed original depth, width, speed of work, and whether every section was built at once. But every number rests on assumptions. How hard was the chalk on the day they dug it? How many people worked at a time? Did they dig only in summer when agricultural demands allowed? Did they build in a single gathering or return season after season? How much material was lost to later erosion? Were the ditches all equally deep? Did some groups have more experience than others? We do not know. What we can say is that this was not casual labour. It was not a few people deciding to improve a path between two settlements. The Greater Cursus demanded planning before the first antler entered the ground. It demanded people able to mark a long route, divide work into manageable sections, maintain tools, organise food, and coordinate bodies across a huge area. There were specialists, perhaps not specialists in the modern sense of full-time occupations, but people with practiced knowledge. People who knew which antlers made the strongest picks. People who understood how chalk fractured. People who could shape a stable ditch profile instead of causing the sides to collapse. People who knew where to place spoil to create a continuous bank. People who could judge a line across changing ground, keeping the monument pointed along its intended course. And then there were the people who made the work possible without necessarily digging at all. Someone hunted, butchered, cooked, gathered firewood, fetched water, watched children, cared for livestock, repaired clothing, made baskets, and negotiated the tensions that emerge whenever many families camp together. A monument is never built only by the people holding tools. It is built by an entire social world operating behind them. That is why the ditches are more than holes in the ground. They are evidence of commitment. Each antler strike was a small act. One person loosens a fragment of chalk, another carries it a few meters. Another adds it to a growing bank. On its own, almost nothing. Repeated thousands of times across days, seasons, perhaps years. Those small acts create a line nearly 3 kilometers long. And perhaps that repetition was part of the point. Ritual does not have to mean a mysterious ceremony hidden from us forever. It can mean shared actions performed in a meaningful place, according to rules that matter to the people taking part. Digging may have been labour, but it may also have been ceremony, communities gathering, working, eating, exchanging gifts, honouring ancestors, and physically investing themselves in a place that would outlast them. The monument was built from chalk, but it was also built from obligation, from alliances, from remembered promises, from the ability to persuade people that this line across the plain mattered enough to sacrifice time, strength, food, and precious tools. And once those banks rose and those ditches cut deep into the earth, the builders had created something no one could ignore. The question is, what were people meant to do when they arrived there? That is the question that turns a giant ditch into something more complicated than a construction project. What were people meant to do when they arrived there? The most tempting answer is also the simplest. They moved. The Greater Cursus is long, narrow, and deliberately bounded. It begins at one end of the landscape and reaches toward another. 2 parallel ditches create a broad corridor between them, while terminal ditches close or define the ends. Even without a roof, walls, or gates in the modern sense, it has the basic shape of a route. A place that seems to ask you to go from here to there. This is why archaeologists have often connected Cursus monuments with processions. Perhaps people gathered at one terminal, entered the long central space, and travelled together along its length. Maybe they walked in groups carrying food, tools, offerings, or the remains of the dead. Maybe the journey itself mattered more than whatever happened at the end. But we have to slow down here. The Greater Cursus does not come with a sign saying processional route this way. No Neolithic voice has survived to explain the rules. There are no written rituals, no maps showing where participants stood, no clear record of a crowd moving from one end to the other. The people who made this monument left us ditches, banks, scattered finds, and a landscape altered so profoundly that we are still trying to understand it nearly 6,000 years later. So processions are a possibility, a powerful possibility, but still a possibility. And once you begin asking how people moved around the Cursus, the obvious answer becomes less obvious. Did people actually walk inside the corridor? The space between the ditches was broad enough for movement. That much is clear. A group could have travelled through it, perhaps following a route marked only by the monument itself. The banks on the inside may have made that central space feel distinct from the open plain beyond. You would not be trapped exactly, but you would be framed. Your attention pulled forward by long parallel edges converging toward the horizon. Think about what that does to the mind. On an open plain, you can walk in any direction. Your eyes roam. The horizon is everywhere, but place 2 long boundaries on either side of you, and suddenly movement has a direction. The landscape begins to behave like a passage, not a prison. Not a road in the modern sense, more like a decision made visible. You are here. The line continues ahead. What happens if you follow it? but perhaps people did not move inside it at all. Maybe the ditches and banks were too awkward to cross casually, making the central strip a protected or restricted zone. Perhaps participants walked alongside the monument, following its outer edges while looking toward the space within. Perhaps only certain people entered: ritual leaders, elders, families connected to particular ancestors, or individuals carrying out a ceremony whose meaning was not meant for everyone. Or perhaps crossing was the point. A ditch is an obstacle, even a shallow one. A bank is a statement. To step over one, descend into a cut in the chalk, climb up again, and enter the interior is not like wandering across ordinary grassland. Your body notices the boundary. You have crossed from one kind of space into another. That may have been enough. Human beings create meaningful places with boundaries all the time. A doorway, a fence, the edge of a cemetery, the line around a sports field, a rope around a sacred shrine. None of these needs to be impossible to cross. Their power comes from the fact that crossing requires recognition. You know that something has changed. The Greater Cursus may have worked in a similar way. It did not need huge walls to control people. It only needed to make people aware of where they were, where they had come from, and where they were going. And the terminals may have been especially important. At either end, the long parallel ditches did not simply fade away into the plain. They were closed or marked by cross-ditches, creating distinct ends to the monument. That suggests arrival and departure mattered. A terminal could have been a meeting place, a threshold, a place to gather before entering, or a place where a journey ended and another action began. Imagine a community approaching one of those ends. They have travelled across Salisbury Plain, perhaps from scattered settlements and camps. Some know the monument well, others may be arriving for the first time. Ahead of them, fresh white chalk banks cut across the darker ground. Beyond them lies a corridor extending farther than any ordinary enclosure needs to extend. They stop at the end. What now? Do they enter together? Do they wait for a signal? Do some remain outside while others go in? Do they bring the dead from a nearby long barrow, or animals for a feast, or objects to be deposited? Do they walk toward a ceremony at the far terminal? Or do they simply stand, looking along a line that has transformed the plain into a place of expectation? We cannot know, but that uncertainty is not a reason to dismiss the question. It is exactly why the shape matters. Later, prehistoric Britain would produce ceremonial avenues, long formal approaches leading toward monuments, especially around Stonehenge. Those avenues are not identical to the Greater Cursus. They belong to different moments, different communities, and probably different ritual systems. We should not assume that an older earthwork had the same purpose just because both are elongated. Still, the comparison is hard to ignore. Again and again, prehistoric builders created lines in the landscape. They built routes that connected significant places. They used banks, ditches, posts, and stones to guide the body and focus the eye. They understood that a journey can be ceremonial, that walking can become a form of participation, that the distance between two places can matter just as much as the places themselves. The Greater Cursus may be an early and enormous expression of that idea. Not necessarily an avenue, not necessarily a processional track, but perhaps a landscape made to organise movement, gathering and attention on a scale no ordinary settlement required. And its direction raises another question, because this line was not laid out randomly. It crossed a landscape already filled with ridges, valleys, burial places, and distant horizons. The people who built it were not just moving earth. They were choosing where to point it, and that choice may have involved more than movement across the ground. It may have involved the sky. The Greater Cursus runs broadly from east to west across Salisbury Plain. Not perfectly east-west, not like a line drawn with a ruler across a map, but clearly with a strong directional axis. Stand near one end and look along its length, and the monument seems to pull your attention toward the horizon. That has led to one of the most intriguing theories about the Cursus. Was it connected to the sun? Prehistoric monuments across Britain are often discussed in astronomical terms. Stonehenge, of course, is famous for its relationship with the solstices. At midsummer, the rising sun appears in a carefully framed direction. At midwinter, the setting sun marks another. Those alignments are real, measurable, and built into the architecture of the later stone monument. So when archaeologists see another huge monument nearby, laid out on a long axis, the question naturally follows. Could the Cursus have been pointing toward a significant sunrise or sunset too? Some researchers have suggested that its orientation may connect broadly with solar events, perhaps the rising or setting sun around midsummer or midwinter. Others have looked at the Cuckoo Stone, a surviving sarsen stone near the western end of the Greater Cursus, and wondered whether it once acted as a marker in a much larger system of sightlines. The idea is compelling. Imagine people gathering near the western terminal. Ahead of them, the long earthwork extends across the plain. Beyond it, the horizon rises and falls. At a particular time of year, perhaps the sun appeared at a familiar point in the distance. Maybe the monument helped people anticipate it. Maybe it turned an ordinary sunrise into a public event. But here is where we need to be careful. A line that points toward the sun does not automatically prove that the monument was an observatory. The sun rises and sets somewhere on the horizon every day. Across a full year, those points move back and forth over a wide arc. Give archaeologists a long monument, a distant ridge, and enough possible dates, and it becomes dangerously easy to find an alignment after the fact. This is one of the biggest problems in archaeoastronomy. You can stand in almost any ancient landscape and draw lines between monuments, hills, stones, rivers, and celestial events. Some of those lines may be meaningful, some may be coincidence. The difficult part is separating a real prehistoric intention from a pattern our modern minds want to see. And human minds really do want to see patterns. We connect dots. We find faces in clouds. We look at a long earthwork and a prominent stone and instinctively ask whether they belong together. Sometimes that instinct leads to genuine discoveries. Sometimes it leads to stories that sound ancient but have no archaeological foundation. The Cuckoo Stone is a perfect example. It is a large sarsen stone, one of the natural sandstone blocks scattered across this region. Today it stands alone, weathered and isolated. But in the Neolithic landscape it may not have been alone at all. Other stones could have stood nearby. Wooden posts may have marked routes or gathering places. Features now destroyed by ploughing, erosion, and later construction may once have changed how the entire area looked. So the stone may have been important. It may have served as a landmark visible from a distance. It may have marked an approach to the Cursus. It may have been incorporated into a ritual route. It may even have helped define a line of sight toward the horizon. But may have is doing a lot of work there. We do not have a Neolithic blueprint showing a priest standing beside the Cuckoo Stone and watching the midsummer sun rise. We do not have inscriptions explaining that the Greater Cursus was built to track the seasons. And unlike Stonehenge, the Cursus does not preserve an obvious architectural arrangement designed to frame one extremely precise celestial event. That distinction matters. Still, an alignment does not need to function like a calendar to be meaningful. This is the part that often gets lost. Maybe the builders were not trying to calculate the exact day of the solstice. Maybe they did not need a monument that worked like a giant prehistoric clock. A broad direction toward the rising or setting sun could have carried symbolic meaning without demanding precision. East is where light begins, west is where it disappears. The cycle of sunrise and sunset is visible to everyone. You do not need writing, mathematics, or a formal priesthood to understand that the sun travels across the sky, that winter days are short, that summer days are long, that light returns after darkness. For farming communities beginning to organize their lives around seasons, animals, crops, ancestors, and shared gatherings, those changes may have mattered deeply. The sky could have provided a language for ideas that were otherwise impossible to explain. Birth, death, return, darkness, renewal, and perhaps the cursus translated some of those ideas into earth. If you enjoy mysteries like this, the channel's book about the 12 unexplained mysteries is available through the website, with the link in the description. Because this is exactly the kind of mystery that refuses to give us one easy answer. The evidence is real, the monument is real, but the meaning survives only in fragments. And the sky was only one part of the design. The land itself mattered too. Salisbury Plain is not flat in the way a map makes it look flat. It is made of gentle ridges, shallow valleys, folds in the chalk, and horizons that appear and disappear as you move. A person walking along the Cursus would not experience it as a simple straight strip. The surrounding ground would rise, dip, conceal distant places, then reveal them again. That changes everything. A monument can be aimed at a hill without being aimed at the sun. It can direct attention toward a valley, a spring, a burial mound, a ridge where people approach from the distance, or a point where the land opens toward another important place. Visibility itself can be ritual. Think about the difference between building in a hollow and building on a ridge. In a hollow, you are enclosed by the land. The outside world disappears. On a ridge, you can see for miles. You can watch people arriving. You can see storms moving across the plain. You can follow the sun across the horizon. You can look toward other monuments and know that they are out there, even if they are too distant to reach in a single walk. The builders of the Greater Cursus understood this landscape intimately. They would have known where water gathered after rain, where chalk was easiest to cut, where a person could see the longest distance, and where a low ridge interrupted the view. Choosing this exact line was probably not an accident, but neither does that mean every feature had one single meaning. The monument may have been designed around several ideas at once: movement along an axis, separation between inside and outside, connections to burial places, sight lines towards stones or ridges, a relationship with the changing sun, gathering people from across the plain and making them look, walk, and remember together. That is more complicated than calling it a solar temple, and probably closer to the truth. The measured evidence tells us that the Cursus was deliberately positioned, massively constructed, and integrated into a particular landscape. Its ditches, terminals, orientation, and relationship to nearby features can be surveyed. Its age can be estimated. Its physical form can be mapped with extraordinary precision. But the celestial story remains more uncertain. Possible? Yes. Proven? Not yet. The danger is not in asking whether Neolithic people watched the sky. Of course they did. Every human society watches the sky. The danger is assuming that every monument with an axis must be a machine for measuring it. The Greater Cursus may have pointed toward the sun, or it may have pointed through a world where sky, land, ancestors, and distant places were impossible to separate. Because by the time this vast earthwork was completed, Salisbury Plain was becoming something more than open country. It was becoming a sacred landscape, and that phrase can sound vague. A sacred landscape. It brings to mind temples, priests, formal ceremonies, maybe a place set apart from ordinary life. But on Salisbury Plain, There was no single temple, no city, no written scripture telling us what people believed. There were ridges, valleys, chalk, grassland, burial mounds, timber posts, pits, stones, and enormous ditches cut into the earth. And over centuries, perhaps millennia, people kept coming back. That is what made the landscape sacred. Not one monument standing alone. A network of places. Places where ancestors were buried. Places where communities gathered. Places where people marked boundaries, performed rituals, exchanged goods, found marriage partners, settled disputes, mourned their dead, and reminded themselves that they belonged to something larger than one household or one generation. The Greater Cursus was part of that network. It did not appear in an empty wilderness and remained the only thing that mattered. Around it were long barrows, the long earthen burial mounds built by some of Britain's earliest farming communities. There were pits cut into the chalk. There may have been wooden structures and markers that have vanished almost completely. And in later centuries, new monuments would rise nearby, including the structures that eventually made this plain famous across the world. Stonehenge, but that came later, before the great stones. Before the famous circle, before the blue stones were carried from western Wales, and before sarsens were raised into towering trilithons, this ground had already become a place people treated differently, a place with memory. Long barrows are especially important here because they show what changed when farming arrived in Britain around 6,000 years ago. Hunter-gatherer groups had moved through landscapes seasonally, following animals, plants, rivers, and coastlines. But farming communities became more rooted to particular territories. They cleared woodland, they planted crops, they kept livestock. They returned to the same fields year after year, and they began building monuments that stayed put. A long barrow could hold the remains of several people. Sometimes bones were placed inside stone chambers or wooden structures before the mound was built over them. Sometimes bodies seemed to have been handled, moved, or deposited over time. These were not always simple graves in the modern sense. One body, one burial, one sealed resting place. They may have been places where the living maintained a relationship with the dead. Imagine what that means. Your grandparents are not just remembered in stories. Their bones rest inside a mound visible on the horizon. Your community can point to it. Children grow up walking past it. Travellers see it from a distance. It tells everyone that this land has a history, that people lived here before you, that your group has roots. The landscape becomes a kind of archive, not written in books. Written in chalk, earth, wood and stone, and when the builders of the Cursus chose their line across the plain, they were almost certainly not choosing a blank canvas. They were working in a terrain already shaped by natural features and human memory. A ridge was not just a ridge, a valley was not just a valley. A spring, a prominent stone, an ancient burial mound, or a route people had walked for generations could all carry significance. This is one reason archaeologists are so careful about the order of monuments. If one structure cuts through another, it must be later. If a burial mound sits beside an earthwork without disturbing it, the relationship becomes more complicated. If a pit lies beneath a bank, it may preserve traces of activity from before the bank existed. Every overlap is a clue. Every ditch is a timeline cut into the ground. And Salisbury Plain contains many of those clues. Some features were clearly older than the Cursus. Some may have been built around the same broad period. Others came centuries later. The point is not that every monument belonged to one master plan. It almost certainly did not. Neolithic communities did not gather around a table, unroll a map of southern England, and decide where every future mound, henge and stone circle should go. But later builders could see what earlier builders had done. They could see mounds on the skyline. They could recognise old earthworks, even when grass had softened their edges. They could know that a particular rise in the land was associated with ancestors, gatherings or stories whose origins were already fading into the past. And then they built beside those places. Sometimes they avoided them. Sometimes they incorporated them. Sometimes they cut across them, perhaps deliberately, making a statement that a new generation, a new community, or a new ritual order had arrived. That is how sacred landscapes grow, not all at once. Not according to one fixed design. They grow through repetition. A burial here, a ditch there. A path walked so often that it becomes a remembered route. A gathering place used at certain times of year, a monument built where an older monument can be seen. Then another generation arrives and inherits all of it. This is why it can be misleading to imagine Stonehenge as a sudden eruption of prehistoric genius in an otherwise ordinary field. Stonehenge was extraordinary. Its engineering, its imported stones, its carefully arranged architecture, all of that was extraordinary. But it was not the beginning. It was built in a landscape where people had already been moving earth on a massive scale. A landscape where the dead had been placed in long mounds. A landscape where huge linear enclosures like the Greater Cursus had transformed the ground itself into something ceremonial and enduring. The stones did not create Salisbury Plain's importance from nothing. They entered a place that was already important, and that raises a fascinating possibility. Maybe the people who began Stonehenge did not simply choose a convenient location. Maybe they chose a place dense with inherited meaning. Maybe the old Cursus, already ancient by their time, was part of what made this area powerful. A monument from a past they could not fully understand, but could not ignore either. Think about how we treat ancient ruins today. We may not know exactly why they were built. We may disagree about their meaning, but their age gives them authority. Their survival makes them feel significant. They remind us that other people stood here long before us, looking at the same horizon and asking questions we can no longer hear. Neolithic people may have felt something similar when they encountered monuments built by their own distant ancestors. The Greater Cursus was not just an earthwork. It was already old memory embedded in the plain. And soon the sacred geography of Salisbury Plain would change again. That change begins with the dead. Across the chalklands around Salisbury Plain, early farming communities built long barrows. These were elongated mounds of earth and chalk, sometimes more than 100 metres long, often with a broader end that contained a burial chamber or timber-lined space. From a distance, they looked like low ridges shaped by human hands. Up close, they were something much more deliberate. They were houses for the ancestors, not houses in the ordinary sense. Nobody lived inside them. But the people placed within these mounds did not simply disappear from community life. Their remains could stay accessible. In some long barrows, bones were deposited gradually, moved, sorted, and added to over time. Archaeologists sometimes find the remains of many individuals rather than one person buried in one moment. That matters. A modern grave usually marks an ending. A person dies, is buried, and the grave is closed. But some Neolithic tombs may have worked differently. They may have been places where the living returned, places where bones were brought in after a body had decomposed elsewhere, places where a community could gather, perform ceremonies, and maintain contact with generations that had come before. The dead were not gone. They were present in the landscape. And for people beginning to farm, that presence may have been enormously important. Farming ties a community to particular ground in a way hunting and gathering often does not. You invest labour in fields. You depend on grazing land for animals. You watch the same seasons return to the same valleys. You need to know where your people belong. A long barrow could make that claim visible. Not necessarily as a legal land deed, because there were no written laws or property documents. But in a deeper social sense, the mound said, "Our ancestors are here. Our dead are here. We have history here. Imagine arriving from another valley. You cross the open chalk downland and see a great earthen mound on the ridge. You may not know every name connected to it. You may not even belong to the group that built it. But you understand the message. This is not untouched ground. This place has people behind it. People with ancestors. People with memory." The Barrow turns ancestry into geography, and that may help explain why these monuments were so common in the early Neolithic. They were burial places, yes, but perhaps also meeting places, territorial statements, ritual centres, and anchors for communities still adapting to a new way of life. They connected the living to the dead. They connected families to land. They connected one generation to another. Now compare that with the greater Cursus. The Cursus is long, enormously long, but it is not a tomb. It has parallel ditches and banks, creating a vast linear enclosure across the plain. It seems to organize movement, space, direction, maybe access. It stretches across the landscape as if someone took a line and made it real with chalk, labour and collective effort. A long barrow feels different. It gathers inward. Its shape has a focus. A chamber, a mound, a place where the remains of people were concentrated. Even when it is visible from far away, its meaning seems to pull attention toward a specific point. Here are the ancestors. Here is the place of burial. The Cursus does almost the opposite. It pulls your attention along. It gives no obvious chamber, no clear central burial deposit, no straightforward evidence that it was built to hold the dead. You do not approach it as you would approach a tomb. You encounter it as a route, a boundary, a corridor, or an enormous strip of ground set apart from the ordinary world. And that difference may be the clue. The Neolithic people of Salisbury Plain did not have one single way of dealing with death, memory, and belonging. Long barrows may have provided one answer. They created fixed places for collective ancestors. They gave communities somewhere to return, somewhere to mourn, remember, negotiate identity, and perhaps ask for the approval of those who had gone before. But a community is not held together only by shared ancestors. It is also held together by gatherings, by agreements, by processions, by seasonal rituals, by encounters between groups who may be related, allied, suspicious of one another, or competing for access to land and resources. The Cursus may have belonged to that larger world. Perhaps people moved through it during ceremonies. Perhaps its banks marked a route that was walked at particular times of year. Perhaps it separated sacred activity from everyday life. Perhaps it linked important places that no longer survive, including burial mounds, springs, timber structures, or natural features that held meaning. We cannot say with certainty, but the absence of burials inside the greater Cursus is not an archaeological failure. It is evidence. If the builders had wanted a giant tomb, they knew what a tomb could look like. They had long barrows. They had traditions for handling the dead, constructing chambers, raising mounds, and making ancestors visible. The Cursus was built differently because it may have served a different purpose. That does not mean the dead were irrelevant to it. In Neolithic thought, the boundary between burial, ritual, land, and community may have been impossible to separate. A procession through the Cursus could have honoured ancestors. A gathering inside or beside it could have settled relationships between living groups. Its line across the plain may have passed through a landscape already inhabited by remembered dead. But it did not contain them in the way a long barrow did. That is important because it stops us from forcing every ancient monument into the same explanation. Not every ditch is a grave. Not every mound is a temple. Not every huge construction was built for the purpose we would expect. The long barrows tell us that early Neolithic communities were deeply concerned with ancestry. The Cursus tells us they were concerned with something else as well. Something involving movement, connection, separation and shared space on a scale far beyond one tomb. And beneath, beside, and sometimes hidden by these great monuments, archaeologists have found traces of an even older landscape. Small features, easy to miss, but capable of changing the whole story. Those traces do not look impressive at first. A pit, a dark stain in the chalk, a scatter of burnt flint, a post hole visible only because a wooden post rotted away thousands of years ago, and the hole slowly filled with darker soil. To an untrained eye, it can look like nothing, but archaeology is often the art of taking nothing seriously. The greater Cursus survives because it was enormous. Its ditches were cut deep into the chalk. Even after thousands of years of erosion, ploughing and weather, their outlines can still be traced across Salisbury Plain. Smaller activities leave smaller scars. A wooden building disappears. A fire goes out. A meal is eaten. Tools are repaired. An animal is butchered. A ceremony takes place and leaves behind a few fragments of bone, charcoal, pottery, or flint. Then generations pass. Soil moves, roots grow, worms churn the ground. Later people dig their own pits, build their own monuments, and disturb what came before. By the time archaeologists arrive, the original scene is gone. What remains is a broken sentence, and around the Cursus there are many broken sentences. Excavations and surveys across the Stonehenge landscape have revealed pits of different sizes and dates, post holes where timber once stood, deposits of animal bone and worked flint, and traces of activity that do not neatly belong to one monument or one moment. Some features may be older than the Cursus, some may have been contemporary with it. Others were dug centuries later, after the great earthwork had become part of an already ancient landscape. The problem is that an isolated pit does not come with a label. Was it used to store food? Was it dug to extract chalk? Did it hold rubbish from nearby activity? Was it a place for a deliberate deposit, perhaps an offering of animal bone, tools, or pottery? Was it simply the hole left after someone removed a post? Sometimes the answer is clear. Often it is not, and that uncertainty can be frustrating. We want a complete plan. We want the outline of a village, the walls of houses, the paths people walked between them. We want to point at a map and say, this was where they lived, this was where they gathered, this was what they believed. But prehistoric life rarely survives in that kind of detail, especially in a landscape used again and again over thousands of years. Imagine a patch of chalk downland visited by small communities for generations. One group stops there to hunt, another clears brush and lights fires. Later, farmers bring animals through the valley. They dig a pit. They bury something in it. They raise a long barrow on a nearby ridge. Then at some point, hundreds of people come together and cut the huge ditches of the Cursus. None of those events needs to leave a complete settlement. In fact, they probably would not. Early Neolithic communities may have moved between places seasonally. They could have had scattered houses, temporary camps, gathering sites, grazing areas, burial grounds, and ritual locations rather than one permanent village centre. A place might be intensely important without being continuously occupied. That is one of the hardest ideas to recover from the ground. Repeated use does not always create a town. Sometimes it creates fragments. A pit here, a post hole there, a broken tool dropped in the grass, a concentration of charcoal, a carefully placed skull or antler, evidence that people returned, did something meaningful, and left again. The landscape becomes a record not of one settlement, but of many visits. And that raises an unsettling possibility. What if the Greater Cursus was not built across empty land at all? What if the plain was already socially charged, not crowded in the modern sense? There were no streets, no markets, no dense neighbourhoods stretching to the horizon. But people may already have known this ground through stories, burials, seasonal gatherings, hunting routes, and memories attached to particular ridges, springs, valleys, and clusters of trees. A place does not need buildings to be inhabited by meaning. Think about how people experience a familiar landscape today. A field can be just a field to a stranger, but to someone who grew up nearby, it can be where their family worked, where an accident happened, where celebrations were held, where someone was buried, where an old road used to run. Now multiply that feeling across generations for Neolithic communities. The chalkland around Salisbury Plain may have been filled with places whose importance was understood without needing to be explained. A mound on the horizon, a particular bend in a dry valley, a spring that appeared after rain, a place where ancestors were buried, a ridge where groups met, a route followed by animals or by people year after year. The cursus may have been inserted into that remembered world, not as the first act of monument building, but as a dramatic new act within an older pattern of use. That does not mean every pit and post hole was sacred. Ordinary life leaves archaeology too. People needed fuel, food, shelter, tools and places to discard waste. The danger is turning every dark stain in the soil into a ritual mystery. But the opposite danger is just as serious. If we call everything practical, we can miss the fact that practical life and ceremonial life may not have been separate in the way they often are for us. Digging a pit could be useful, filling it with selected objects could also be meaningful. Raising a post could support a structure. It could also mark a place, frame a gathering, or become part of a ritual that left no written explanation behind. The ground preserves actions. It does not preserve intentions. Still, intentions can sometimes be approached through patterns. When certain deposits appear in unusual locations, when objects are carefully selected, when pits cluster near monuments, when features align with routes or boundaries, archaeologists begin to suspect that something more than disposal was happening. Not certainty, never certainty, but a stronger possibility. And even uncertainty has a timeline. The earliest traces suggest people had been moving through and using this wider landscape long before the stone circles made it famous. Later traces show that activity continued as new monuments appeared. The result is not one clean story with one group arriving, building and vanishing. It is a sequence. First scattered acts on a remembered landscape, then tombs for ancestors, then the immense line of the Cursus cutting across ground that already carried history, and after that more change, more pits, more posts, more gatherings, more people interpreting the same plain in new ways. The Cursus was not built in a vacuum. It was built in a landscape already marked by human attention, and it would itself become part of the evidence future generations had to reckon with. Then, centuries later, the scene changed again, not with another ditch, with stone. With stone. That is the moment most people imagine when they think of Stonehenge. Massive uprights dragged across the landscape, lintels raised overhead, a circle taking shape against the sky, but Stonehenge did not appear the day after the Cursus was finished. The Greater Cursus is generally dated to the early Neolithic, roughly 3600 to 3400 BC. Stonehenge began later, around 3000 BC, when people dug its first circular ditch and bank enclosure, and the famous stone settings came later still, beginning around 2500 BC. That is a gap of centuries. In human terms, it is the distance between the medieval world and today. long enough for languages to shift, families to forget names, customs to change, old places to acquire stories no one can verify anymore. By the time the great Sarsen stones were being raised, the Cursus may already have looked ancient. Its ditches would still have marked the ground, though softened by weather and grass. Its banks may have been lower than when they were first built, but its huge length running across the plain for nearly 2 miles would have remained impossible to ignore. Imagine arriving in this landscape around 2500 BC. You see burial mounds old enough to belong to the ancestors of the ancestors. You see the long fading line of a colossal earthwork. You see traces of timber structures, pits, paths and gathering places. And then, in the midst of this already crowded ceremonial landscape, a new kind of monument begins to rise. Not a ditch running toward the horizon, a circle, not chalk banks and excavated earth, timber, stone, carefully arranged spaces that gather people into a centre. This was not simply one monument replacing another. The old Cursus remained, the long Barrows remained. The landscape did not reset every time a new community built something different. Instead, later builders worked among the remains of earlier generations. They inherited a terrain already filled with memory, even if they no longer knew exactly what every monument had meant. And that may be the key. Stonehenge was new, but the place was not. For centuries, perhaps millennia, people had been returning to this part of Salisbury Plain. They buried their dead here. They dug enormous ditches here. They built with wood. They held gatherings whose details are lost forever. The architecture changed, but the importance of the landscape may have endured. That is a very different idea from saying that one continuous people carried out one continuous ritual for thousands of years. We cannot prove that. The communities who built the Cursus may not have shared the same beliefs as those who raised the first stones. They may not even have spoken the same language. Their descendants may have changed through migration, intermarriage, new technologies, new animals, new trade connections, and new ideas about death, ancestry, and the sky. But places can outlast belief systems. A mountain can remain sacred even when the religion changes. A river crossing can remain important long after the people who first used it are gone. A ruined monument can become meaningful precisely because no one fully understands it anymore. Perhaps that is what happened to the Cursus. By the later Neolithic, it may have been seen as an ancestral work, a boundary from a remote age, a processional route whose original ceremonies had been forgotten, or simply a feature so enormous that later people had to account for it when they planned their own monuments. And the new monuments were very different. The Cursus was built as a vast linear earthwork. It stretched outward, it directed attention across distance, from one terminal enclosure toward another, through a long corridor of chalk and grass. Stonehenge concentrated attention inward. Its banks formed a circle. Its stones formed circles and horseshoes. The architecture enclosed space, framed movement, and created a focal point. You did not just travel along it. You entered it. You stood within it. You looked through carefully arranged openings toward particular parts of the surrounding landscape. Then came timber circles. At nearby sites, enormous wooden posts were raised in rings and arcs. Timber monuments may have been brighter, more immediate, more alive than the weathered stones seem to us now. Wood could be cut, shaped, replaced, and rebuilt. It connected ritual architecture to forests, labour, seasonal cycles, and the living world. Stone, by contrast, made a different claim. Stone was hard to move, hard to shape, hard to raise. Some of Stonehenge's smaller bluestones came from Western Wales, more than 100 miles away. The giant Sarsens were brought from the Marlborough Downs. Their presence announced planning on a scale that went beyond one household or one village. And then there were the avenues. The Stonehenge Avenue, with its parallel banks and ditches, linked the monument toward the River Avon. It created a route, a ceremonial approach, a way of moving between one kind of place and another. That is where the comparison becomes especially interesting. The cursus had also been about movement, or at least it appears to have structured movement across the landscape. The avenues did something similar in a new architectural language. They were narrower, more focused. They connected specific monuments and destinations. They turned the wider landscape into part of a designed experience. So maybe the people who built Stonehenge were not rejecting the old earthworks at all. Maybe they were responding to them, not copying them, not necessarily understanding them, but building in a landscape where long lines, banks, ditches, horizons, and controlled approaches already carried weight. The Greater Cursus even passed remarkably close to the area where Stonehenge would later stand. That proximity may be coincidence. It may reflect practical choices about terrain, or it may suggest that both monuments drew power from the same part of the plain. A ridge, a horizon, a route, a place already known. We should be careful here. Archaeology can show us where monuments stand. It cannot give us the conversation between builders separated by 800 years. No one left a sentence saying, "Build the stones beside the ancient ditch." But later, people did not need written records to recognize that something extraordinary had happened there before them. They could see the earthwork. They could walk beside it. They could tell stories about the people who made it. And perhaps, standing beside that immense fading line, they decided that their own age needed a monument just as powerful. Only this time, they would make it stand upright against the sky. But there is one more shift we need to understand. The people who raised Stonehenge's great sarsen stones were not simply the same people, unchanged, carrying on the work of the people who dug the Cursus 800 years earlier. They lived in the same broad region. They inherited some of the same roots, some of the same horizons, perhaps even some of the same stories. But prehistoric Britain was changing all the time. New people arrived, old communities adapted, families married across long distances. Technologies spread, diets changed, animals changed, ideas about the dead changed. And over thousands of years, even a landscape filled with monuments could not hold society still. The builders of the Greater Cursus belonged to the early Neolithic world of Britain, around 3600 BC. This was already a new world compared with the hunter-gatherer Britain that had come before it. Farming had reached the islands only a few centuries earlier. People were keeping cattle, sheep, and pigs. They were growing crops. They were building long barrows for their dead. They were clearing woodland, making polished stone axes, and creating enormous communal monuments out of chalk, timber, and earth. But calling them the Cursus people can be misleading. They did not wear matching uniforms. They did not belong to a nation called the Cursus culture. Archaeologists use categories because they need names for patterns in pottery, burial customs, houses, tools, and monuments. But real people are never as neat as the labels we give them. A community living near Salisbury Plain may have had ties to people in Wales, the Cotswolds, southern England, or across the Channel. They may have exchanged stone axes, animals, marriage partners, food, and ritual knowledge. Some may have travelled far. Others may have spent their entire lives within sight of the same hills. And even within one generation, not everyone would have understood a monument in the same way. For one family, the Cursus might have been a place connected to ancestors. For another, it might have marked a gathering route, a boundary, a place where cattle were moved, or a site associated with ceremonies only certain people could take part in. Sacred places do not always have one meaning. They gather meanings over time, like layers of soil building up in a ditch. Then the centuries passed. The early Neolithic gave way to the later Neolithic. Monument building did not stop. In some ways it became even more elaborate. People built circles, henges, timber structures, avenues, and new kinds of ceremonial spaces. Pottery styles changed, feasting traditions changed. Networks of exchange expanded. Some communities seem to have placed growing importance on large gatherings, seasonal events, and monuments that brought many groups together. Stonehenge began in that changing world. Its first earthwork enclosure was built around 3000 BC, long after the Greater Cursus. Then, around 2500 BC, the monument entered the phase most people recognize today. The huge sarsens were erected, the blue stones were rearranged. The architecture became more permanent, more visually commanding, and more technically ambitious. But that period also coincides with another profound transformation in Britain. People associated with what archaeologists call the bell beaker phenomenon began appearing in Britain. The name comes from their distinctive bell-shaped pottery. But again, the label can hide the real story. Bell beaker was not one tribe marching across Europe under one flag. It was a wide network of people, objects, technologies, styles, and social connections stretching across enormous distances. In Britain, ancient DNA shows that this era involved substantial migration from continental Europe. Over the following centuries, much of the ancestry associated with earlier Neolithic populations was replaced by ancestry linked to these incoming groups. That sounds simple when reduced to one sentence. It was not simple. It does not mean every earlier person vanished overnight. It does not mean every newcomer was an invader. It does not mean one population arrived, fought one battle, and erased everyone else from the map. Human movement is rarely that clean. Some people may have come as families. Some through marriage networks, some through trade and seasonal travel. Some communities may have mixed quickly. Others may have remained separate for generations. And genes are not identities. A person can inherit most of their ancestry from one population and adopt the language, rituals, and sacred places of another. A community can preserve a monument built by people whose names, ancestors, and beliefs are no longer remembered. Or they can transform that monument until it means something entirely new. This is what makes the Cursus so haunting. By the time Stonehenge's stones rose, the builders of the Cursus were already distant. Not distant in miles, distant in time. Their grandchildren's grandchildren had lived and died so many times that the original construction might have slipped beyond ordinary memory. The people raising stones may have known the Cursus as an old work, something made by ancestors, spirits, giants, or people from an age before their own. They may have respected it. They may have used it as a landmark. They may have woven it into ceremonies we can no longer reconstruct. Or they may have passed it without much thought. That possibility matters too. Not every ancient monument remains sacred forever. Some become boundaries. Some become convenient paths. Some disappear beneath grass until a later generation barely notices them. A place can be immensely important for 500 years, then lose its meaning so completely that no story survives. And yet the Cursus did survive physically. Its ditches remained. Its banks remained. Its line continued to shape movement across the plain. Even if its builders' identities faded, their labour stayed written into the land. That is the strange power of monuments. People disappear. Languages disappear. Kinship systems, rituals, and beliefs can dissolve almost completely. But a ditch cut into chalk can outlast all of them. The Cursus builders were not erased in one dramatic moment. Their story faded through change. New generations inherited the ground, but not necessarily the meaning. New communities brought different ancestors, different connections, different ways of marking the dead and organising the living. And eventually, when people looked across Salisbury Plain, the old earthwork may have seemed less like a human project and more like part of the world itself. A line in the grass, a scar in the chalk, a mystery left behind by people whose names had already become unreachable. And now ancient DNA gives us a way to ask a question archaeologists once could barely touch. What happened to the people themselves? For most of the history of archaeology, the answer had to come from objects. A new kind of pot appears, a different burial style spreads. Metal tools begin turning up in graves, and researchers have to decide what that means. Did new ideas travel? Did local people copy a fashionable style? Did small groups of outsiders arrive? Or did a much larger migration reshape the population? Those questions are hard because objects move differently from people. A beautiful pot can be traded. A new ritual can be copied. A metal axe can pass through 10 pairs of hands before it reaches a distant village. None of that necessarily means the people using those things came from somewhere else. DNA changes the picture. Ancient DNA is recovered from human remains, usually from dense bone in the inner ear, or from teeth, where tiny traces of genetic material can sometimes survive for thousands of years. Scientists compare those traces with DNA from people buried at other sites in other regions and in earlier or later periods. They are not reading a person's memories. They are not discovering the language someone spoke, the songs they sang, or what they thought when they stood beside a monument. But they can track broad patterns of biological ancestry. They can see when populations remained genetically connected over long periods. They can detect mixing between groups that had previously been separated. And sometimes the pattern is so large that it reveals a demographic transformation no pot or stone tool could prove on its own. That is what happened in Britain during the Bell Beaker period. Around 2500 BC, when Stonehenge was entering its great stone building phase, people associated with Bell Beaker pottery and continental European connections were arriving in Britain. Ancient DNA studies suggest that over the next several centuries there was a very substantial shift in the ancestry of Britain's population. The scale of that shift is startling. Genetic evidence indicates that most ancestry linked to earlier Neolithic farming communities was replaced by ancestry connected to populations from continental Europe, particularly groups with roots in the Eurasian steppe and Central and Western Europe. In broad terms, Britain after the Beaker transition was genetically very different from Britain before it. Not entirely different, not empty, then suddenly repopulated. Human history almost never works like that, but different enough that we have to take migration seriously. This was not just a new pottery style spreading from village to village. It was not simply local communities deciding that bell-shaped cups looked impressive. Real people were moving across the channel. They were arriving with different family histories, different networks, and perhaps different social structures. Over generations they had children with people already living in Britain. Their descendants spread, and eventually their ancestry became dominant in the genetic record. That is the closest thing we have to an answer for the title's most unsettling word. Erased, but DNA forces us to be precise. It does not show that the Cursus builders were hunted down in a single campaign. It does not reveal a final battle on Salisbury Plain, or a plague that swept every early farming family away, or one terrible year when an entire people disappeared. There is no evidence for that kind of simple ending. What it shows is a long-term loss of genetic continuity. The communities whose ancestors had built the Greater Cursus around 3600 BC belonged to the early Neolithic population of Britain. By the time the Bell Beaker transformation was well underway, roughly 1,000 years later, much of that earlier ancestry had become difficult to trace in the people buried across Britain. That does not mean every descendant vanished. Some early Neolithic ancestry probably survived through mixing. Some families may have remained in particular regions longer than others. The data is still incomplete. Ancient DNA depends on who was buried, where bones survived, which sites are excavated, and which individuals can be sampled. Britain is not a spreadsheet. It is a landscape of thousands of communities, most of them invisible to us. But the overall pattern is clear enough to be profound. The people who dug the Cursus were not simply transformed into the people buried with bell beaker objects. They were separated by centuries of change and by a major shift in ancestry that reshaped the islands. And here is where the story becomes more complicated, not less. Genetic ancestry is not culture. Imagine two people living in the same settlement. One may have grandparents who arrived from across the Channel. The other may descend mostly from families who had lived in Britain for generations. They could still speak the same language, marry into the same community, herd the same cattle, mourn at the same graves, and gather at the same monument. DNA can tell us that their ancestors came through different population histories. It cannot tell us whether they saw themselves as different. The reverse is true too. A population can undergo enormous genetic change while old traditions survive. Newcomers may adopt local sacred places because those places already command the landscape. They may hear stories about old earthworks and make those stories their own. They may preserve rituals whose original meanings have been forgotten. Or they may deliberately reject the past and create a new identity around new kinds of monuments, new burials, new materials, and new claims to the land. We cannot pull those answers directly from a genome. DNA does not tell us what the Cursus meant to a Beaker period family walking near its ancient banks. It cannot tell us whether they knew who built it. It cannot tell us whether they called its makers ancestors, strangers, giants, spirits, or nothing at all. But it does tell us why memory may have fractured. The Cursus had already stood for nearly 1,000 years when the major ancestry shift associated with the Bell Beaker period began. Think about that. In our own time, 1,000 years takes us back before the Norman conquest, before English was the language we know, before the political map of Britain had anything like its modern shape. Now imagine inheriting a monument that old while your society itself is being remade by migration, intermarriage, technological change, and new ways of burying the dead. The builders would have been almost unimaginably distant. Not just ancient, ancestrally uncertain. And Stonehenge makes this timeline even more important. The first ditch and bank at Stonehenge were created around 3000 BC, long after the Cursus. The famous sarsen arrangement rose around 2500 BC, close to the beginning of the Beaker era transformation. Later phases continued after that, as the population of Britain was changing again. So when we say the people behind the stones, we have to be careful. Stonehenge was not the work of one unchanging population. Its history stretches across many centuries. Different generations built, rebuilt, visited, buried, feasted, travelled, and perhaps argued over what the place was for. The Cursus belongs even earlier. Its builders were early Neolithic farmers living in a Britain newly shaped by agriculture. The people involved in Stonehenge's final major eras belonged to a later world, one increasingly marked by metalworking, new burial customs, wider continental links, and substantial demographic change. Same plane, different histories. That is what disappearance may really mean here. Not a single annihilation, not a proven act of violence, not a people vanishing overnight beneath the grass. It means that identifiable communities can fade from the record. Their descendants may be absorbed into other populations. Their genetic signatures may become diluted. Their language may be replaced. Their rituals may stop being practiced. Their names, if they had names for themselves that reached beyond a village or kin group, are gone completely, and eventually even the memory of who made a monument can disappear. The ditch remains, the bank remains, the massive labour remains visible in the shape of the land. But the people who organised it become unreachable. Ancient DNA does not solve that mystery. In a way, it makes it deeper. It shows that the past was not a smooth line from the Cursus to Stonehenge, from Stonehenge to us. It was a series of crossings, arrivals, disappearances and transformations. The monument endured. The community that made it did not endure in any simple identifiable form. And that leaves us with one last question. When later people encountered this enormous old line across Salisbury Plain, did they see a dead monument? Or did they find a way to make it part of their own world? So, did they see a dead monument? The honest answer is that we do not know. But the landscape gives us clues. The Greater Cursus was not a small structure that could vanish after a few generations. It ran for nearly 1.5 miles across Salisbury Plain. Its ditches were cut deep into the chalk. The chalk dug from them was heaped into banks. When newly built, those banks would have been bright, raw, and unmistakable, a long artificial scar across open ground. Even after the first ceremonies ended, even after the people who made it were gone, the monument would not have disappeared overnight. Rain would have softened the banks. Grass would have covered the exposed chalk. Wind would have carried soil into the ditches. Generations of animals would have crossed it. But earthworks can survive for an astonishingly long time. For centuries, perhaps millennia, the Cursus would still have shaped movement across the plain. A person walking toward it would see the rise of a bank, the dip of a ditch, the unnatural straightness stretching toward the horizon. Later people may not have known its original purpose. But they almost certainly knew it was there, and that matters. Archaeologists have found evidence of later activity around the Cursus. The Stonehenge landscape did not freeze when its early Neolithic builders left. Long barrows, pits, timber structures, round barrows, burial mounds, roads, settlements, and later field systems all appeared in the wider area across thousands of years. The Cursus became part of a landscape that later communities repeatedly used, reshaped, and interpreted. But using a landscape is not the same as honouring every monument within it. Some later monuments seem to have been placed with remarkable awareness of what was already there. The famous round barrows of the Bronze Age were often built on prominent ridges and high ground, places where ancient earthworks and natural features were impossible to ignore. At the eastern end of the Greater Cursus, a group of later burial mounds became known as the Cursus Barrows. Their builders chose to bury their dead beside an earthwork that was already ancient. Was that reverence, possibly? Imagine a Bronze Age community raising a burial mound near this immense old boundary-like line. The Cursus may have given the place authority. It may have made the ground feel different from ordinary pasture. A grave beside such a monument could connect the newly dead to a past too old to remember. Not necessarily to known ancestors. The actual builders were separated from them by many centuries. But ancient places can become powerful precisely because nobody knows who first made them. They become places of origin, places of spirits, places where the land itself seems to remember something people have forgotten. But there is another possibility. Later communities may have used the Cursus for practical reasons. A bank makes a landmark, a ditch can mark a route, a boundary, or a useful edge between grazing areas. If you need to tell someone where to meet, you do not say somewhere on the plain. You say by the old ditch or beyond the long bank. An ancient monument can remain meaningful without remaining sacred, and sometimes people may simply have been indifferent. That possibility is important because we often assume later builders treated older monuments with careful respect. But prehistoric people were not museum curators. They lived on the land. They needed roots, fields, timber, pasture, water, and places to bury their dead. An old bank might be avoided because it was inconvenient to cross. Or it might be cut through because a new path was more useful. A ditch might be treated as a powerful ancestral feature in one generation, then become no more remarkable than an old hedge line to another. There is no single response that has to explain thousands of years, and the relationship between the Cursus and Stonehenge is especially tempting to overread. Stonehenge was built long after the Cursus. Its creators inherited a plain already marked by older monuments. They did not choose an untouched wilderness. They chose a place where generations before them had dug ditches, raised mounds, buried their dead, and created ceremonial routes. That means the Cursus formed part of the world Stonehenge's builders saw. But did Stonehenge deliberately reference it? Perhaps. The two monuments lie close enough that it is hard to imagine the Cursus was unknown. Their positions, their orientations, and the wider arrangement of monuments across the plain have led researchers to ask whether later builders were consciously engaging with an older sacred geography. Maybe the Cursus helped define a zone of ceremony. Maybe it was a remembered route. Maybe it marked a boundary between different ritual spaces. Maybe its ends and its long axis still mattered to people who had lost every story about its construction. But close proximity is not proof of a master plan. Monuments accumulate in places that already attract people. A prominent ridge, a clear horizon, good grazing, reliable routes, or an established burial ground can draw activity again and again. Later people may have built near the Cursus because the wider landscape was important, not because they understood the Cursus itself. That uncertainty is frustrating, but it is also the point. Archaeology is very good at finding actions that leave material traces. A grave, a pit, a post hole, a deposit of animal bone. A fresh ditch cutting through an older one. What it struggles to find is quiet attention. If later people walked along the Cursus bank, told stories about it, avoided crossing it at certain times of year, or brought offerings that left no surviving trace, archaeology may never detect it. If they looked at it and felt nothing at all, that can be equally invisible. Silence in the record does not prove total abandonment. It may mean nobody returned, or it may mean they returned in ways that did not involve digging, building, burning, burying, or leaving durable objects behind. It may mean the evidence was destroyed by erosion and later farming. It may mean archaeologists simply have not excavated the right patch of chalk. The Cursus survived long enough to become ancient history more than once. Its builders may have been forgotten, its original meaning may have dissolved. But the line itself remained, crossing the plain like a message in a language nobody could fully read. And perhaps that was enough, because even when a people disappear, their labour can continue shaping the choices of strangers who come after them. But if the Cursus remained visible for so long, why do its builders seem so completely gone? Why is there no name attached to them? No legend that can be traced back to the people who first cut those ditches. No village preserved beneath the grass. No account telling us why thousands of hours of labour were poured into a line across the plain. The simplest answer is also the hardest to accept. They did not leave the kinds of evidence we are trained to look for. Early Neolithic Britain had no writing, no carved histories, no lists of rulers, no temple records, no messages sealed into stone for future generations. The people who built the greater Cursus could speak, remember, teach, argue, mourn, and tell stories. They may have had elaborate traditions explaining where they came from and why this place mattered. But those traditions lived in human minds and human voices. and voices vanish fast. A story can last for centuries if it is repeated carefully. It can survive through family lines, seasonal ceremonies and gatherings where the young are taught what the old people know. But it only takes disruption for that chain to break. A community moves, a language changes, new people arrive. Old rituals lose their meaning. A few generations pass, and a story that once seemed impossible to forget becomes something uncertain, then fragmentary, then gone. By the time Stonehenge was being built, the Cursus was already old. By the Bronze Age it was older still, and today the distance between us and its builders is not just measured in years. It is measured in missing voices. Their homes have also almost disappeared. That is one of archaeology's cruelest biases. Tombs survive better than houses. Ditches survive better than fences. Great stone monuments survive better than the ordinary places where people cooked, slept, repaired tools, raised children, and planned the next season's work. An early Neolithic house was not designed to defeat time. Timber rots, thatch decays, clay walls collapse. Floors are churned by roots, worms, animals, and later human activity. What remains may be no more than a stain in the soil. A shallow post hole, a scatter of burnt flint, a broken pot buried in the wrong place. And on Salisbury Plain, even those traces faced thousands of years of damage. Later communities grazed animals there. They cut paths across it. They dug graves, pits, and new monuments. In more recent centuries, farming transformed the surface again. Ploughing does not have to destroy a monument in one dramatic moment. It can erase it slowly, one pass at a time. Each season shaves a little soil from a bank. Each year drags earth downhill. Each generation makes an old rise less visible than before. Then there is erosion. Rain fills ditches. Wind moves dust. Frost breaks down exposed chalk. Grass stabilizes the ground, but it also hides what lies beneath. The bright white banks that may once have announced the Cursus across the open plain gradually darkened beneath turf and soil. The deep cuts softened, their edges blurred. What was once an engineered line became a faint swelling in the land. Eventually, people could walk over the monument without realizing they were standing on it. That does not mean the builders were deliberately erased. It is tempting to imagine a later people arriving, rejecting the old monument and wiping away the memory of those who made it. And sometimes in human history, that absolutely happens. New rulers destroy old temples. Conquerors rename places. Religions suppress earlier traditions. Memory can be attacked on purpose. But there is no clear evidence that this happened to the builders of the Greater Cursus. Their disappearance may be less like a crime scene and more like a process. A long, slow historical process. People changed, communities shifted. Beliefs developed in new directions. New monuments became the centres of attention. The Cursus did not need to be demolished for its original meaning to fade. It only needed to become old enough that nobody remembered the reason it had been made. And then Stonehenge changed everything. Not necessarily for the people living nearby at the time. They may have understood the landscape as a complex whole, full of old earthworks, burial places, roots, and sacred features. But for later generations, and especially for the modern world, Stonehenge became the symbol. The stones were dramatic. They stood above the ground. They survived in a way timberbanks and chalk ditches could not. Stonehenge became famous because it is visible. The Cursus became obscure because it is subtle. One is a ring of giant uprights against the sky. The other is a line in the grass, best understood from maps, aerial surveys, and excavations. One seems to announce itself. The other asks you to look twice. That difference has shaped public memory. When people think of prehistoric Salisbury Plain, they think of stones. They imagine circles, solstices, and massive blocks dragged from distant hills. They do not usually imagine generations of farmers using antler picks to carve enormous ditches into chalk. They do not imagine a monument built not upward, but outward, not to dominate the skyline, but to organize movement across the land. So the Cursus builders seem erased partly because another monument became impossible to ignore. But the evidence is still there. The ditch lines remain beneath the grass. In some places they are visible as faint marks. In others they survive only as changes in soil, layers of chalk rubble, and dark fills where sediment slowly accumulated after the digging stopped. Archaeologists can trace their course. They can measure their depth. They can recover fragments of worked flint, animal bone, and charcoal from the deposits. Those ditches are not just holes in the ground, they are preserved decisions. Someone chose this route. Someone marked its beginning and end. Someone organised labour. Someone returned day after day to deepen the cuts and raise the banks. Hundreds, perhaps thousands of people participated in an act that demanded planning, cooperation, and a shared reason to continue. We may never know the words they used for this place. We may never know whether they saw it as a path, a boundary, a ceremonial corridor, or something stranger than any category we have today. But they are not absent. They are still there in the shape of the land. And that shape still has the power to unsettle us. Because the Greater Cursus is not a minor feature hiding in Stonehenge's shadow. It is one of the largest and earliest monuments in the entire landscape. Built around 3600 BC, centuries before the first stones rose at Stonehenge, it stretched for almost 3 kilometres across Salisbury Plain. 2 enormous parallel ditches cut through the chalk. Banks made from the excavated earth ran alongside them. At its widest, the monument enclosed a corridor more than 100 metres across. This was not a casual boundary made by a few families clearing fields. It was a major act of construction. The builders had no metal tools, no wheeled vehicles, no written plans. They used antler picks, animal bones, wooden tools, and human muscle to break into hard chalk, lift spoil, carry it, and pile it into banks. The labour required was immense, not impossible, but immense enough to tell us that people came together for a purpose larger than ordinary survival. And they chose a remarkable place to do it. The Cursus did not sit in an empty wilderness waiting for Stonehenge to make the plain important. It belonged to a landscape already being shaped by early farming communities. Long barrows held the dead. Causewayed enclosures brought people together. Pits, post settings, paths, and older traces marked the ground. The land was becoming a map of memory. Then the Greater Cursus drew one of the boldest lines on that map. Its position matters, its scale matters, its relationship to later monuments matters. The Cursus ran across ground that would eventually become part of the wider Stonehenge ceremonial landscape. Later people placed burial mounds nearby. They built Stonehenge close to its southern side. They continued to move through, alter and reinterpret this part of the plain for thousands of years. That does not mean the Cursus was built as a preview of Stonehenge. It was not. Stonehenge's builders inherited a landscape already dense with old places and old meanings. To them, the Cursus may have been ancient, perhaps mysterious, perhaps sacred, precisely because it had been there longer than anyone could remember. But what did it mean to the people who first made it? That is the question still waiting beneath the grass. Was it a processional route, a place where people moved in formal gatherings from one end to the other? The long enclosed corridor makes that possibility hard to ignore. Perhaps ceremonies unfolded along its length. Perhaps groups entered at one end, travelled through a controlled space and emerged changed in some way at the other. Was it a boundary? Not a practical fence, because its ditches and banks would not have kept people out in any simple sense. But boundaries do not have to stop bodies. They can organize ideas. They can separate the everyday world from ceremonial ground, the living from the dead, the familiar from the dangerous. One community's territory from another's, a cursus may have marked a threshold, a line people crossed only at certain times and under certain rules. Or was it connected to the sky? Some researchers have explored the possibility that the cursus aligned with significant features on the horizon, perhaps places where the sun rose or set at particular times of year. Other interpretations focus less on astronomy and more on the physical landscape itself, the ridges, valleys, springs and routes that shaped how people experienced the plain. The answer may not be one or the other. For Neolithic communities, the sky, the land, the ancestors, and seasonal survival may have been woven together in ways that modern categories split apart. A route could also be a ritual. A boundary could also be a calendar. A ditch could also be a statement about who belonged to a community, who had the right to gather, and who shared obligations to the dead, the land, and one another. That is why the mystery has lasted. The monument survives, but the instructions for reading it do not. Still, archaeology is not finished with the cursus. Far from it. Every new method gives researchers another way to ask questions without simply tearing the site apart. High-resolution geophysical survey can detect buried pits, lost banks, post holes, and subtle changes in the soil around the monument. Ground-penetrating radar may reveal structures or disturbances beneath areas that have never been excavated. Laser scanning and aerial mapping can expose earthworks so faint that they are almost invisible at ground level. Then there is environmental evidence. Tiny grains of pollen preserved in ditch fills can help reconstruct the vegetation around the monument. Charcoal can reveal patterns of burning. Snails, seeds, animal bone and microscopic traces of soil can tell us whether the surrounding land was open grassland, woodland pasture, cultivated ground, or a changing mixture of all of them. If archaeologists can better understand what people saw when they stood beside those newly cut white chalk ditches, they may understand more clearly why this exact route was chosen. New excavations could matter too, though carefully targeted ones are more likely than huge trenches. A single overlooked deposit at the base of a ditch might contain charcoal suitable for more precise radiocarbon dating. A cluster of animal bones might hint at feasting. Worked flint could reveal what people were doing during construction or later visits. Even the sequence of sediments filling the ditches can show whether the monument was maintained, altered, neglected, or revisited over generations. And any one discovery could change the story. Not because archaeology is unreliable, but because the past is bigger than the evidence we have recovered so far. Each interpretation is built from fragments. The cursus is not speaking in sentences. It is speaking in soil layers, chalk rubble, faint alignments, and absences. Perhaps that is the deeper lesson of this place. A monument's original meaning is never the only meaning it has. To its builders, the greater cursus may have been a living centre of ceremony, labour, identity, and belief. To the people who built Stonehenge nearby, it may have been an ancestral work from a vanished age. To later communities, it may have become a landmark, an old boundary, or simply a strange rise in the grass. To us, it is evidence, mystery, and a warning against assuming that the biggest stories are always written in stone. The stones survived above the horizon, but beneath the grass an older monument still stretches across the plain. Its builders remain mostly unnamed. Their language is gone. Their ceremonies are gone. Their reasons cannot be recovered with certainty. Yet their work remains. A line cut into chalk almost 6,000 years ago, still asking us to imagine the people who stood there, looked across the open land, and decided that this place had to be changed forever. And maybe that is where the story of the Greater Cursus becomes bigger than Stonehenge. Stonehenge is famous because it rises above the ground. Its stones are visible, photographed, measured, rebuilt in our imaginations again and again. It has become one of the most recognizable places on Earth. But the Greater Cursus was already there, centuries before the first bluestones were brought onto Salisbury Plain. Before the Great Sarsen Circle stood against the horizon, Neolithic communities had taken this landscape and marked it with an enormous act of collective effort. They cut a corridor nearly 3 kilometres long into the chalk. They raised banks beside it. They made a place that could not be ignored. And then they left no explanation, no inscription saying why it was built, no carved image of a procession, no surviving story passed down through the generations in words we can understand. We have the shape of the monument. We have its ditches, its banks, its position among barrows and later ceremonial sites. We can estimate its age. We can calculate the labour. We can trace the changing communities who lived, buried their dead, and built new monuments around it. But the central thought behind it, the moment when someone first imagined this impossible line across the plain, is gone. Think about what that means. A group, or perhaps many groups, had to decide that ordinary life could pause. People had to gather, food had to be produced and shared. Tools had to be made. Antlers had to be collected and shaped into picks. Chalk had to be broken apart, basket by basket, and carried out of the ditches. Someone had to organise the work. Someone had to persuade others that it mattered. And generation after generation may have understood that their labour was part of something larger than any one household. Why was the cursus a route for ceremonies that unfolded across the land? A controlled passage between places of spiritual importance? A boundary between different communities, or between the everyday world and a sacred one? Did people gather there seasonally, following the movement of the sun, the return of animals, the rhythms of planting and harvest? Did it connect the living to ancestors buried in nearby long barrows? Or did it serve a purpose we have not even considered? That is the humbling part. The people who made it did not leave us enough evidence to choose one answer with certainty. Their monument survived. Their meaning did not. And yet, they were not simply replaced by a blank space. For thousands of years, Salisbury Plain remained a place where people returned, built, buried, travelled and remembered. The cursus became part of the ground later communities inherited. Long after its ditches were first cut, new burial mounds appeared nearby. Stonehenge rose close to its southern side. Later visitors moved through a landscape already crowded with traces of older lives. Every generation encountered the work of those earlier builders. Some may have known stories about it. Others may have only seen ancient banks and hollows in the grass, features so old that their origin had become uncertain. To Stonehenge's builders, the cursus may already have belonged to a deep ancestral past. It may have been respected, reused, avoided, or simply absorbed into a ceremonial landscape whose meanings were constantly changing. That is how landscapes preserve memory, even after the people who made them are gone. Not perfectly, not clearly, but stubbornly. A ditch fills with soil. A bank softens under rain and wind. Wood rots, bodies disappear. Languages fall silent. Entire systems of belief can vanish so completely that later people do not even know they existed. But the altered ground remains. It carries a faint record of decisions made by people whose names were never written down. So when we say the cursus builders were erased, we should be careful. There is no proven single catastrophe in which one people vanished overnight. No final battle we can point to. No document describing a population being driven from Salisbury Plain. The reality was probably slower, more human, and in some ways more unsettling. Communities changed, descendants mixed with newcomers. Old customs lost their force, new beliefs transformed old places. Over centuries, then millennia, the builders' names, voices, stories, and much of their world slipped beyond recovery. They were not necessarily erased from history in one event. They were erased from memory, and that can happen even to people who build something enormous. Maybe that is why the Greater Cursus matters so much. It forces us to look past the monument everyone knows. Before Stonehenge became the symbol of this landscape, another monument had already stretched across it, immense and deliberate, made not from imported stone, but from the earth itself. The stones became famous, the earthwork became almost invisible. But invisibility is not insignificance. Somewhere on this plain, nearly 6,000 years ago, people looked at open chalk country and saw a ceremonial line that did not yet exist. Then they gathered enough hands, enough food, enough tools, enough shared belief to make it real. Their creation outlasted their language. It outlasted their villages. It outlasted whatever songs, rituals, arguments, and promises brought them together. And it still leaves us with the same question. What could have been important enough to make people dig a mile-long monument into the land? If you have your own interpretation of the Greater Cursus, share it in the comments. Was it a route, a boundary, a gathering place, a calendar written across the plain, or something else entirely? And let us know where you are listening from. If you enjoyed this journey into the monument before the monument, please like, comment, and subscribe. And again, tell us where you're listening from. The best way to support the channel is by listening on Spotify through the link in the description.